The drawing-room of the Whitmore townhouse in Cheapside bore the weight of genteel poverty with quiet dignity. Once, the furniture had gleamed with polish and pride. Now the velvet showed the faded ghosts of what it had been. Catherine Whitmore stood near the window, watching the street below, her fingers worrying at the worn lace of her handkerchief. The afternoon light caught the copper in her hair, transforming it momentarily into something precious. Behind her, she heard the sound of voices, her mother's uncertain murmur, and beneath it the sharp, cutting tones of Aunt Constance. The words were indistinct, but their meaning required no clarification. Money, always money, the eternal problem that had consumed her family since her father's death 3 years prior. The door opened. Catherine turned, composing her features into the expression of mild interest expected of a young woman of her station. Her mother entered first, eyes red-rimmed though she'd tried unsuccessfully to conceal this fact. Behind her came Aunt Constance, her face arranged in an expression of grim satisfaction, the look of someone who had just delivered news of catastrophic importance. "Catherine," her mother said softly, "please sit. We have received a most extraordinary visitor." A visitor? Catherine's heart quickened, though she kept her expression serene. In their current circumstances, visitors were rare. Important visitors were rarer still. The gentleman who entered the drawing-room did so with the careful movement of someone managing considerable pain. Catherine recognized him immediately, or rather, she recognized the rumors of him. The Duke of Ravensbrück, the one London pitied. He was nothing like she expected. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and measured, carrying the weight of titles and authority. "I shall be direct. Circumstances require that I marry. I have chosen you." The words hung in the drawing-room like incense, heavy, intoxicating, impossible to ignore. Catherine felt her mother's sharp intake of breath. Even Aunt Constance seemed momentarily robbed of speech. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," Catherine heard herself say. Her voice, at least, remained steady. This was a small victory. "I am not in the habit of repeating myself," the Duke said. There was no cruelty in the statement, merely fact. "However, given the unusual nature of this proposition, I shall make an exception. I require a wife, discreet, intelligent, unlikely to succumb to hysteria or the vapors." His grey eyes moved across her face with the intensity of a man assessing a painting. "You satisfy these requirements." "Your Grace," Catherine began, choosing her words with the precision of someone walking a narrow ledge above an abyss, "I am honored by this extraordinary proposal, yet I confess myself bewildered as to the reasoning behind such a selection. Surely there are any number of young ladies in London whose families would better serve your interests." Something flickered across his features. Was it approval? "There are. However, I did not ask for the most advantageous match. I asked for the correct one, and there it was. The implied mystery, the unspoken knowledge that his choice meant something beyond the rational calculations of society. "The settlement is generous," Aunt Constance interjected, her voice sharp as a blade. "Extraordinarily generous. Catherine would be foolish to refuse." Catherine did not look at her aunt. She was looking at the Duke, at the way his jaw tightened slightly at Constance's words, as though such mercenary considerations pained him. There was something else there too, a flicker of something that might have been loneliness quickly suppressed. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and now there was something almost gentle in his voice, though his expression remained controlled. "You have 48 hours to provide your answer. Should you accept, we shall marry within the week. Should you decline, I shall not trouble your family again." It was not a threat. Somehow, this made it worse. It was merely the statement of a man accustomed to having his preferences respected. He departed as he had arrived, with careful, measured movements and the grace of someone managing considerable pain. When he was gone, the drawing-room seemed to shrink, the air to become thinner. Catherine returned to the window. Below, she watched as a carriage pulled away from the townhouse, its crest catching the late afternoon sun. The Duke of Ravensbrück, the man all London pitied. In 48 hours, she would change her answer. What she did not yet know was how thoroughly her answer would change her life. Catherine did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed in the small room she shared with the accumulation of her life's disappointments, and she thought about fate, about choice, about the terrible mathematics of survival. The Duke of Ravensbrück did not love her. This was not surprising. Love was a luxury for those with security. What he offered was security itself, a commodity more valuable than the entirety of love's promises. By morning, the household had transformed. News had spread through the servants like fire through dry grass. A duke, A proposal. The word settlement had been repeated so frequently that it had lost all meaning, becoming instead a sort of talisman against poverty. Her mother came to her room as the pale light was beginning to creep through the window. Without speaking, she took Catherine's hand and pressed it between both of her own, which trembled slightly. "You need not accept," her mother said softly, though her eyes said something entirely different. "I will not force you into any marriage, regardless of—" "Mamma," Catherine said gently, squeezing the thin fingers, "we have £17 remaining. The rent is due in a fortnight. Aunt Constance has made it abundantly clear that her patience with supporting us is exhausted." Her mother's eyes filled with tears she did not shed. This was perhaps the cruelest part of poverty, that it demanded not merely sacrifice, but the sacrifice of dignity. Her mother had to stand there, knowing that her only child's future was being bartered like goods at market. "He is not a cruel man," Catherine continued, surprising herself with the certainty of this statement. "I do not think he will be unkind." "No," her mother agreed quietly, "but kindness is not love, Catherine. And you deserve—" "What do I deserve, Mama?" Catherine asked, not unkindly. "I deserve a great many things. I deserve a father who did not gamble away our security. I deserve a family that values me for something other than my utility. But I have learned that what we deserve and what we receive are two entirely different calculations." Her mother said nothing more. What was there to say? At precisely 3 o'clock that afternoon, Catherine composed a letter. Her handwriting was neat, educated, controlled. She had spent her entire life learning to control things that could be controlled. Her expression, her voice, her handwriting. This letter was simply another exercise in that discipline. "Your Grace, I have considered your proposal with the seriousness it merits. While the circumstances are unconventional, I recognize in them a solution to difficulties that weigh heavily upon my family. Therefore, I accept your offer of marriage, provided that you find me acceptable upon closer acquaintance. I shall defer to your judgment in all matters of arrangement. Respectfully, Miss Catherine Whitmore." She did not mention that she had read everything the scandal sheets had printed about him, that she had pieced together the fragments of his reputation into something approaching understanding. That she lay awake wondering what flaw, what curse, what terrible circumstance had made all of London pity a man with a dukedom. The Duke's response came within the hour. His handwriting was bold, aristocratic, each letter formed with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his words heeded. "Miss Whitmore, your acceptance is noted. We shall be married on Friday next at St. James. The ceremony will be private. Dr. Ashford will attend, along with your family and my own. You will remove to Ravensbrook House immediately following the wedding. Appropriate wardrobe has been arranged. I have instructed my staff to provide you with every courtesy. I shall not explain the nature of the circumstances that necessitate this union. However, I give you my word that you will be treated with respect and that I will not demand of you anything beyond the scope of your agreement. Respectfully, Sebastian Alden, Duke of Ravensbrook." Catherine read this letter perhaps a dozen times. Each reading revealed something new, the formality that bordered on apology, the careful delineation of boundaries, the promise that seemed to acknowledge that she was entering into something that required promises. That evening, she stood before her mother in the modest day dress that was her best and therefore worst possession. The fabric had faded from repeated washing. The lace was mended in places that should never require mending. "This is a fine outcome given the circumstances," Aunt Constance announced, entering the room with her characteristic disregard for privacy. "The Duke is wealthy beyond imagination. Even his eccentricities are manageable, provided Catherine does not do anything foolish." Catherine said nothing. She was becoming quite skilled at this, at filling silence with her own presence rather than her own voice. "Catherine," her mother said carefully, "do you have any questions? Anything you wish to know about marriage?" Catherine turned from the window. Her mother's face was flushed, her eyes determinedly averted. This conversation was costing her considerable courage. "No, Mama," Catherine said gently. "I trust that circumstances will provide what instruction I require." This was not entirely a lie. What it was, precisely, Catherine could not have articulated. But somewhere beneath the fear and the resignation, there was something else, something that wondered, something that looked at the Duke's grey eyes and the mystery behind them and felt not only resignation, but curiosity. In 3 days, she would become a duchess. In 3 days, her life would no longer be her own, and Catherine Whitmore discovered that she was not entirely displeased by this prospect. The wedding dress arrived on Thursday morning, in a box of pale cream silk so fine it seemed to be woven from moonlight. Catherine lifted it from its tissue wrappings and felt her breath catch. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever touched. "He has taste," Aunt Constance observed, her eyes narrowing with something between approval and calculation. "This must have cost a considerable sum." Catherine did not respond. She was thinking instead of the implications embedded in this choice. The Duke had not asked her colouring, her measurements, any detail of her appearance. Yet this dress, pale cream to complement her hair, cut in a style that would suggest elegance rather than demand it, seemed designed specifically for her. She moved to the mirror and held the gown against herself. The effect was transformative. For a moment, she was not the impoverished daughter of a ruined man. She was someone worthy of a dukedom, someone worthy of mystery. "You will do," her mother said softly from the doorway, her eyes red from crying that she thought Catherine had not noticed. That night, Catherine sat at her small writing desk and composed a final letter. This one she did not intend to send. It was addressed to the girl she had been a week ago, the girl who had believed in things like love and choice and the romance of self-determination. "Dear Catherine, by tomorrow you will have become someone else, a duchess, the wife of a man you have spoken to for perhaps 20 minutes in total. Tomorrow night, you will enter a bedchamber that belongs to someone who selected you for reasons you do not understand, from a catalogue of possibilities you were never even aware existed. You are frightened, you are also curious. This combination is dangerous. Do not make the mistake of believing that his courtesy implies affection. Do not mistake his protection for regard. He is a gentleman. This much is clear. A gentleman protects his possessions, and you very much are now his possession. But you are also a woman with a mind, with observations, with things to offer beyond the biological requirements of his title. If you are very careful, very clever, you may transform this transaction into something approaching partnership, or you may fail and spend your life as a woman married to a mystery, sleeping beside a stranger, bearing a dukedom that does not love you. The choice, though it does not seem so, is partially yours. Be brave, Catherine. The world will require it of you." She folded this letter and placed it in the bottom of her trunk, where it would remain undiscovered, a message from a dead self to a future self who would have no memory of having written it. The next morning arrived with the inevitability of fate. Catherine dressed in the cream silk gown. It fit perfectly, of course it did, and looked in the mirror at a stranger wearing her face. The woman looking back was composed, dignified, almost serene. Catherine envied her this quality of calm. St. James' Church was small, private, exactly as promised. The Duke stood at the altar in formal black tailcoat, his grey eyes tracking her approach with an intensity that made her breath come shallow. He looked neither happy nor displeased. He looked, Catherine thought, like a man fulfilling an obligation that meant something beyond its surface implications. The ceremony proceeded with the mechanical precision of ritual. Words were exchanged. Vows were spoken. Catherine heard her own voice as though it belonged to someone else, clear, steady, pledging herself to honor and obey a man she had known for less than 48 hours. When the Duke placed the ring on her finger, his hand was warm, his touch clinical. There was no electric spark of connection, no moment of transcendence. There was simply the completion of a transaction. And yet, when he looked at her afterward, when the vicar had declared them married and the small gathering had begun to disperse, something moved in his grey eyes, something that might have been acknowledgement, recognition perhaps, that she had upheld her end of the agreement. "Your Grace," he said formally, offering his arm. The title he used was hers now, Duchess. The word felt foreign on his tongue, or perhaps merely truthful in a way that made her realize how thoroughly everything had changed. She placed her hand on his arm, and beneath the fabric of his coat, she felt the hard tension of him, the careful containment of a man managing considerable pain. "The carriage awaits," he said quietly. "Ravensbrook House is not far. You will wish to rest, I imagine, after the exertions of the day." It was the closest he had come to solicitude. Catherine recognized it as such, and filed this knowledge away with all the other small pieces of him she had begun collecting. As they walked toward the waiting carriage, Catherine caught her reflection in a shop window. For a moment, she did not recognize the woman looking back, the woman wearing the cream silk gown, the woman bearing the weight of a dukedom, the woman who had just pledged her life to a stranger. Then the moment passed, and she was simply Catherine, still afraid, still uncertain, but no longer entirely alone. Ravensbrook House was magnificent in a way that made Catherine's townhouse seem not merely modest, but a mockery of habitation. Grand staircases of dark wood curved upward into shadow. Paintings of stern-faced ancestors observed her passage with aristocratic indifference. The servants, and there appeared to be scores of them, moved about with the trained silence of those who had learned that observation was their primary function. "I have instructed the staff to place your belongings in the Duchess's chambers," the Duke said as they stood in the vast entrance hall. His voice echoed slightly, as though the house itself were listening. "Should you require anything, you need only ring. Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, has been with the family for 30 years. She is reliable and discreet." Catherine nodded, though she was thinking about the singular use of the word chambers, plural, not singular. It seemed to suggest that she and the Duke would not be sharing rooms. This realization brought something that might have been relief, or might have been disappointment. She could not quite determine which. "The drawing room is to the left," he continued, gesturing down a corridor lined with more stern ancestors. "The library is to the right. You are welcome in either, or indeed, in any room of the house that is not explicitly barred to you." "Thank you, Your Grace," Catherine said carefully. "And what rooms are explicitly barred to me?" Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it did not reach his eyes. "My private chambers, my study, where financial matters are conducted, the East Wing, which is closed and not suitable for habitation. Beyond these exceptions, you are Duchess of Ravensbrück. This is your home now." The words hung in the vast space between them, heavy with implication. Your home, as though she had ever had such a thing. As though a place could be transformed from prison to sanctuary simply by being granted permission to inhabit it. "I am tired," Catherine admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "The day has been somewhat overwhelming." "Of course," he said. His courtesies were beginning to feel like walls between them, carefully constructed barriers of propriety that kept actual connection at arm's length. "Mrs. Graves will show you to your chambers. Should you require anything—" "You have already offered this courtesy, Your Grace," Catherine interrupted gently. "I shall not hesitate to avail myself of it should necessity arise." Again, that small movement of his mouth that might have been amusement. "Indeed, I begin to understand why I selected you, Miss—" He paused, and for a moment his composure seemed to crack slightly. "Duchess, you are not inclined toward the hysterics or the flattery that typically characterize young wives. I am inclined toward survival, Your Grace," Catherine said quietly. "The mode of achieving that survival is largely immaterial to me, provided it does not require dishonor." She saw him process this statement, saw something in his grey eyes shift, a recognition of kinship perhaps, or merely of respect for someone who did not pretend that this marriage was anything other than what it was. "Then we shall do quite well together," he said finally. "Welcome to Ravensbrück House, Duchess." Catherine's chambers were a revelation. The Duchess's rooms were not merely spacious, they were magnificent. A large bed with curtains of deep blue velvet dominated the sleeping chamber. The dressing room contained what appeared to be an entire wardrobe, each item more beautiful than anything Catherine had ever owned. The sitting room beyond featured windows that overlooked a garden, a winter garden, bare and austere, but beautiful in its severity. Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 60, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had outlasted several dukes through sheer force of competence. "His Grace has instructed that you are to be provided with whatever you require," Mrs. Graves said, moving about the chambers with the confidence of long familiarity. The wardrobe was selected by Madame Laurent herself, the finest dressmaker in London. "Should any alterations be necessary, you need only speak the word." "When was all of this arranged?" Catherine asked, running her fingers along the edge of a gown in deep green silk. 3 days ago, when His Grace made his decision," Mrs. Graves replied. She was not looking at Catherine directly, which somehow made her answer more reliable. "He is a man who, when he has determined a course of action, executes it with efficiency. It is not sentiment that drives him in such matters. It is practicality and something else." "What else?" Catherine asked. Mrs. Graves finally looked at her directly. "That, Duchess, is something His Grace must tell you himself, if he chooses to tell you at all." After the housekeeper had departed, Catherine sat at the dressing table and allowed herself to simply exist in the strange new reality of her circumstances. She was a duchess. She was married to a man she did not know. She possessed rooms more beautiful than any she had ever inhabited. She rang for hot water and began to remove the cream silk gown with trembling fingers. It was only as she was untying her stays that she became aware of another sound. The Duke's voice, raised slightly in what seemed to be argument, coming from somewhere beyond the walls of her chamber. She went very still, listening. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Pain, barely contained. As though the man she had seen walk so carefully down the aisle this morning had finally, when he believed himself unobserved, allowed something of his true nature to show through. Catherine wrapped herself in her dressing gown and sat on the edge of the magnificent bed, listening to the ghost of his voice fade into silence. And she understood, in that moment, that her curiosity about the Duke of Ravensbrück was no longer a casual matter. It had become essential. He was not simply a man who had chosen her for practical reasons. He was a man in pain, and she, Catherine Catherine Alden now, Duchess of Ravensbrück, had just married him. The question was no longer whether she could survive this marriage. The question was whether either of them could survive it intact. Catherine descended to breakfast the next morning in one of her new gowns, a morning dress of pale grey that somehow made her eyes appear more green than hazel. She had been awake since dawn, caught between the desire to explore her new domain and the anxiety that such exploration might be viewed as presumption. The breakfast room was a study in masculine efficiency, cold meats, fresh bread, coffee that steamed with promise. But it was the figure standing at the window that arrested her attention. The Duke was dressed for riding, his coat a severe dark blue, his boots polished to a mirror shine. Yet something about his posture suggested that this outfit had cost him considerable effort. His left hand gripped the window frame with white-knuckled intensity, as though the simple act of standing required him to anchor himself against some invisible force. "Good morning, Your Grace," Catherine said carefully, moving toward the sideboard. "I trust you slept well." He turned at the sound of her voice, and she caught the brief flash of pain that crossed his features before his expression settled into controlled neutrality. "Tolerably," he said, which was, Catherine was learning, his way of saying nothing at all while sounding responsive. "You have slept?" "Yes, thank you. Your chambers they are lovely." Something about the word chambers seemed to amuse him, though he made no comment on it. Instead, he moved away from the window, and Catherine noted that he did so with deliberation, as though each step required calculation. "I shall be occupied with estate matters today," he said, settling himself into a chair with what appeared to be careful management of his limbs. "You may do as you wish. The library is at your disposal, as are the grounds. There is a morning room that overlooks the garden, should you wish for a quieter space in which to occupy yourself." "Your Grace," Catherine said, and she heard her voice take on a quality of softness that surprised her. "Are you unwell?" She saw him tense, saw the careful mask he wore slip just slightly, revealing something beneath, a question, perhaps, or a warning. "I am managing," he said finally, which was even less of an answer than tolerably. "It is nothing that requires your concern, Duchess." "And yet, I find that it does," Catherine said quietly. She was taking a risk. She understood this. She was stepping across a line that he had carefully drawn, insisting in his courtesy that distance remain between them, but she had spent too long watching people hide pain. She had spent too long being expected to pretend that suffering did not exist. "If we are to live in the same house, share meals, share a name, I believe it is not unreasonable that I should be permitted to observe when my husband is in distress." "You are a duchess, not a nurse," he said, and there was something dangerous in his tone. Not anger, but the steel of a man accustomed to having his boundaries respected. "Do not make the mistake of believing that your position grants you the right to concern yourself with matters beyond the scope of your function." It was a harsh thing to say. Catherine felt the blow of it, felt it strike something tender in her. But she also understood that it was not truly meant for her, that it was directed at something else, something that existed in the space between them. She continued eating her breakfast as though he had said nothing hurtful, as though this first morning was not already revealing the fissures in the careful structure they were supposed to maintain. "I shall explore the library then," she said eventually. "I understand it is quite extensive." "It is," he agreed, and she heard in his tone the relaxation of tension, relief perhaps that she was not going to push further. "The books are largely my grandfather's collection. He was a man of somewhat unconventional interests. You may find volumes that are not typically held in a gentleman's library." After he had left the breakfast room, Catherine sat alone with her cooling coffee and contemplated the puzzle of him. A man in pain, clearly. A man accustomed to controlling that pain through will and discipline. A man who had selected her specifically for reasons he would not explain, and who clearly intended to maintain a distance so vast that it made the physical proximity of marriage seem almost irrelevant. Yet something in the way he had looked at her just now, something that flickered across his face when she had named his suffering aloud, suggested that this distance was not what he wanted, that it was instead what he believed necessary. The library was indeed extensive. It occupied an entire wing on the ground floor, with walls of dark mahogany rising to a ceiling that seemed impossibly distant. Books were everywhere, on shelves, stacked on tables, creating the impression that someone had attempted to accumulate the entire knowledge of the world in a single room. Catherine moved through this collection like a woman in a trance. She found volumes on philosophy, on natural history, on the arts. She found poetry in multiple languages. She found, tucked away on a shelf that seemed deliberately obscured, a collection of medical texts that spoke to practices she did not fully understand. Discussions of treatments, of conditions, of remedies both conventional and experimental. And in the margins of one particularly worn volume, she found handwriting. Not the Duke's formal script, but something more hurried, more personal. Notes, questions, desperate attempts to understand something that would not yield to understanding. She was holding this volume, lost in the implications of what she was reading, when his voice came from the doorway. "I would prefer that you did not read those texts." Catherine turned, the volume still in her hands. The Duke stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes that spoke to real urgency. "Why?" Catherine asked quietly. "If they are in your library, surely they are meant to be read. Unless you are suggesting that as Duchess, my reading material should be restricted to novels and poetry." "I am suggesting," he said, and his voice was weary in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, "that some knowledge is not worth the price of acquiring it, that some questions are better left unasked." "And yet you ask them," Catherine said, gesturing to the margins filled with his handwriting. "Every page is marked with your questions. You are seeking something. Why should I not seek it too?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and gently, so gently that she felt the care in the gesture, removed the volume from her hands. "Because," he said finally, "the answer will make you look at me differently, and I find that I am not prepared for that change. Not yet." He replaced the volume on the obscured shelf, and Catherine understood in that moment that she had discovered something essential about him. He was not afraid of her judgment. He was afraid of her pity, and that fear, more than any courtesy, more than any physical distance, was what truly stood between them. 3 days passed in a rhythm that Catherine began to recognize as the architecture of their marriage. Morning coffee together, where conversation remained carefully bounded by propriety. Separate pursuits during the day, the Duke occupying himself with estate matters, Catherine exploring the house with increasing confidence. Dinner in the formal dining room, where they sat at opposite ends of a table far too long for meaningful conversation. And then the evening separation, each retreating to their own chambers in a house that contained them both while keeping them ruthlessly apart. Catherine had begun to understand the geography of pain. It manifested in small ways, the way he held his left arm slightly stiffly after exertion, the careful positioning of his body in chairs, the occasional moment when his carefully maintained composure would slip and she would catch the raw reality of suffering beneath. She had also begun to understand that this pain was not recent. The medical texts in the library, the margin notes spanning years, the careful precision with which he managed each day, all of this spoke to something chronic, something he had learned to live with by controlling every aspect of his environment. On the 4th evening, Catherine took a calculated risk. She had spent the afternoon in the library, ostensibly reading poetry, but actually absorbing the medical texts with the intensity of someone attempting to decode a language that would reveal profound truths. She had gathered fragments of understanding, mentions of spinal injury, of experimental treatments, of pain management that suggested considerable suffering managed through considerable will. When the Duke entered the dining room for dinner, she was prepared. "Your Grace," she said as the first course was being served, "I have been thinking about your library." She saw him tense slightly. "Indeed. The collection is remarkable," Catherine continued, addressing her soup with concentration, "particularly the texts on medical philosophy. They suggest a mind concerned with understanding rather than merely accepting. You have been reading the medical texts," he said flatly. It was not a question. "I have," Catherine admitted. She looked up from her soup and met his grey eyes directly. "You asked me not to. I did not honor that request. For this I apologize, but I cannot apologize for what I have learned from them, nor for drawing the obvious conclusions." "Catherine," he began, and she heard in the use of her given name the breaking of a significant barrier. What you suspect is precisely why I prefer that you did not know. Suspicion is one thing, knowledge is another entirely. Then tell me, she said quietly. Tell me what I have already begun to piece together. Tell me the truth, Your Grace. If we are to live as husband and wife in any meaningful capacity, do I not deserve that courtesy? She saw the conflict move across his face, saw the warring impulses, the desire to maintain his carefully constructed distance and something else, something that wanted desperately to be known. Not here, he said finally. The staff listen. There are walls in this house that have absorbed more secrets than any walls should bear. Not here. After dinner, he led her not to one of the formal drawing rooms, but to a smaller space she had not yet discovered, a library adjoining his private study, more intimate than the grand library, the shelves here containing volumes that seemed to have been selected with more personal intention. You have been married to me for 4 days, he said, standing with his back to her, looking at the window where darkness pressed against the glass. You have demonstrated more intelligence and less hysteria than I have any right to expect. You have also demonstrated a stubborn refusal to maintain the comfortable distance that I established. I am not certain whether to be grateful or infuriated. Which would you prefer to be? Catherine asked carefully. He turned to look at her, and in the candlelight she could see the exhaustion that underlay everything about him. Grateful, I think, but I am not. I am both and neither, and something more complicated than either. He moved to a chair and sat down with the deliberate care that she had come to recognize as the management of pain. 7 years ago, I was riding in the Cotswolds. A storm came up unexpectedly. My horse bolted. I was thrown, and I fell in such a manner that my spine was damaged. Severely, the physicians said. They were not certain I would walk again, that I would have function, that I would have life in any meaningful sense. Catherine moved to sit near him, careful not to make this seem like sympathy, which she was learning he would repel. But you do walk, she said. I do walk. Through will, through discipline, through treatments that range from the conventional to the experimental, through pain that has become as familiar to me as breathing, I have achieved a level of function that allows me to pass as a normal man in public, provided I am careful not to tax myself beyond prudent limits. He paused, his jaw tightening. What I have not achieved is relief. The pain is constant. It waxes and wanes, but it does not leave. And the medical texts, Catherine said softly. You are searching for a cure that does not exist. I am searching for understanding, he corrected, for some reason why my body has betrayed me so completely, for some mechanism by which I might reverse what has been done. I am searching for hope, Miss Catherine, and I am not fool enough to believe that I shall find it. Then why search at all? She asked. If you do not believe in the possibility of success, why exhaust yourself with the attempt? He looked at her for a long moment. Because the alternative is to surrender, and I am not a man inclined toward surrender. Catherine rose and moved to the shelves, running her fingers along the spines of the medical texts. You selected me because you believed I would not pity you, she said slowly, understanding dawning as she spoke. You selected me because you required someone who could see past this, past the pain, past the limitation, past the carefully maintained facade of a man in control. You selected me because you suspected that I understood something about survival through mechanism rather than hope. Yes, he said, and she heard in that single word the entirety of his vulnerability. And I was correct, which terrifies me. Catherine turned to face him. Why should it terrify you? Because, he said quietly, if you can see me clearly, if you can see the damage and still remain, still function, still treat me as a man rather than as a curiosity or an object of pity, then I will not be able to maintain the distance between us. And I have built my entire life these 7 years on the maintenance of distance. Without it, I am merely a man in pain, and that man is not worthy of the position he holds. Catherine crossed the room and knelt before his chair. She did not touch him. She sensed that touch at this moment would be too much, would shatter whatever fragile equilibrium he was maintaining. Your Grace, she said softly, you selected the wrong woman if you believed I would be content with distance. I have spent my entire life accepting the distance that circumstance forced upon me. I did not choose it, but you are choosing to maintain this distance, and I will not honor that choice. Not anymore. She saw something crack in him, not the controlled facade, but something deeper, something essential. I cannot promise you that this will end well, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, I cannot promise you health or happiness, or a husband who will not spend nights in pain so severe that he must bite his own hand to prevent crying out. I can promise you only difficulty and compromise, and a future that I cannot see clearly." "Then we are equally matched," Catherine said gently, "for I can promise you nothing either, except honesty and presence and a refusal to allow you to hide any more." He did not respond immediately. Instead, he allowed his eyes to close, and Catherine understood that in this moment he was allowing himself to acknowledge the exhaustion that had driven him for 7 years, the exhaustion of maintaining control, of preventing the world from seeing his weakness, of refusing to be known. "If you are to remain," he said finally, "you should know the worst of it. There are nights when I cannot hide the pain, when it requires everything I am to manage it. I cannot guarantee that you will not witness that." "I will witness it," Catherine said, "and we shall manage it together. That is what marriage is it not? The bearing of each other's burdens?" When she left the library that night, Catherine understood that something essential had shifted. The architecture of distance remained, the separate chambers, the careful propriety, the maintenance of form. But beneath it, something new had been constructed, something fragile, perhaps, something that could be broken, but something real. Catherine did not sleep that night. She lay in the magnificent bed in the Duchess's chambers and thought about what the Duke had revealed, and what it meant that he had chosen to reveal it. Trust, perhaps, or desperation, or simply the exhaustion of maintaining a facade so complete that it had consumed his life. Sometime after midnight she heard it, a sound from somewhere in the house, muffled, controlled, but present, a sound that spoke to pain beyond the capacity of will to contain. Catherine rose from her bed without conscious decision, wrapped herself in her dressing gown, and moved through the darkened corridors, guided by nothing more than intuition and the sound of his suffering. The east wing of Ravensbrook House was largely closed, as the Duke had mentioned, but as Catherine moved through the shadowed halls, she found that the east wing was not entirely abandoned. There was a light beneath one door, a room on the ground floor, its door slightly ajar. She pushed it open. The room was a study of sorts, though not the formal study where the Duke conducted estate business. This was something different, a space clearly designed for solitude, for the management of private matters, and there, in a chair near the window, sat Sebastian Alden, Duke of Ravensbrook, with his eyes closed and his body held in the kind of stillness that spoke to considerable physical effort. "Your Grace," Catherine said softly from the doorway. She did not enter further, sensing that he might need space, might need the option of control. His eyes opened. For a moment she saw raw awareness there, the knowledge that he had been discovered, that his carefully maintained privacy had been breached. Then his expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "No," Catherine agreed. "But I am. And now that I am, I cannot pretend that I did not hear you. Cannot pretend that this—" She gestured vaguely at the room, at him, at the evidence of his suffering, "is not happening." "It is nothing unusual," he said, and she could hear the effort it cost him to maintain this pretense. "Merely a night in which the pain is more insistent than others." "How often?" Catherine asked, moving further into the room despite his unspoken objection. "How many nights per week do you spend like this? Alone, managing something that perhaps should not be managed alone?" "That is not your concern," he said, but there was no force behind the words. Catherine moved to a small table near his chair and found what she had suspected she might find: a bottle of laudanum, a glass partially filled with liquid, and the evidence of a man who had been using chemical management to supplement the management of will. "You are medicating yourself," she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "I am managing my condition," he corrected, though the distinction seemed thin. "The pain at night is frequently beyond what will alone can contain. The laudanum allows for sleep, which is necessary for the management of daily function." Catherine looked at the bottle, at the careful rationing it suggested, at the sophisticated understanding of dosage that implied he had been doing this for years. "How much?" she asked. "That is not—" "How much?" she repeated, and there was steel in her voice now. "If you wish me to remain, if you wish this, whatever this is between us, to have any foundation beyond the purely transactional, then you must answer. How much laudanum are you consuming nightly?" He was silent for a long moment. Then, "Enough to sleep. Not so much that I cannot function the following day. I am not addicted, if that is your concern. I have been careful about this, very careful." Catherine set the bottle down and moved to examine him more closely. In the lamplight, She could see the toll that pain and its management were taking on him, the lines around his mouth, the permanent tension in his shoulders, the way his hands rested in his lap, with the careful stillness of someone containing suffering. "I am going to send for Dr. Ashford," she said, "tomorrow morning. He attended our wedding. He is clearly known to your family, clearly trusted by you. You will speak with him about your condition and about the laudanum." "Absolutely not," the Duke said, and now there was anger in his voice, sharp, defensive anger. "I will not have my private medical matters become fodder for household gossip. I will not have my physicians discussing my condition with anyone, including my wife." "Then I shall not tell him about the laudanum," Catherine said calmly. "I shall tell him that you are experiencing pain management difficulties and ask for his assessment. What you choose to reveal to him regarding the specifics of your condition is your own decision. But this," she gestured at the room, at the evidence of his solitary suffering, "cannot continue. You are a duchess of 4 days," he said coldly. "You do not have the authority to dictate medical decisions to me." "No," Catherine agreed, "but I have the authority of a woman who has chosen to stay in a marriage that could have destroyed her, to a man that I barely knew and understood even less. I have the authority of someone who has just listened to you describe 7 years of isolation and pain, and who recognizes in your behavior the patterns of someone who has convinced himself that suffering in private is the same as managing suffering effectively. It is not." She moved to the chair and knelt beside it, careful not to touch him. She could see that contact might shatter whatever careful equilibrium he was maintaining. "I will not betray your confidence," she said quietly. "Everything you have told me, everything I have observed, all of this remains between us, but I cannot stand by and watch you destroy yourself through will alone, so we shall compromise. Dr. Ashford attends tomorrow. You speak with him about pain management strategies, and if you do not, I shall tell him everything. The laudanum, the medical texts, the nights when you cannot hide your suffering. Everything." She saw his hands clench, saw the war between his need for control and his need to simply let someone else bear part of the weight for once. "You are cruel," he said finally, but there was no heat in it. "I am practical," Catherine corrected, "and I am staying, which means that the illusion of solitude you have constructed must now accommodate my presence. This cannot be as difficult for you as losing the pretense entirely." It took him a long moment to respond. When he finally did, his voice was barely audible. "Very well, I shall speak with Dr. Ashford, but Catherine," and again she heard her name used with intention, "you must understand what you are committing to. There will be nights you cannot fix this, moments when all your presence and your will combined cannot lessen what he experiences. Pain of this magnitude does not respond to love or to devotion. It simply exists." "Then we shall exist alongside it," Catherine said simply. "Together." She rose and moved toward the door, understanding that his pride required her departure, that remaining would constitute a mercy he was not yet prepared to accept. "Sleep if you can," she said from the doorway. "Dr. Ashford tomorrow. And Sebastian," she paused, testing the use of his given name, "you are not alone anymore. You can stop pretending that you are." She left him there in that private study, with his bottle of laudanum and his years of solitary management, and the beginning, perhaps, of something that might be called hope. Dr. Ashford arrived at Ravensbrook House at precisely 10 o'clock the following morning, his medical bag in hand, and his expression carefully neutral. Catherine had sent the message herself, keeping the language vague but urgent, a request that he attend the Duke at his earliest convenience regarding a matter of health. The Duke had not spoken to her since the previous night in the study. He had come to breakfast, treated her with perfect courtesy, and then disappeared into his private study, leaving Catherine to wonder if her ultimatum had been a catastrophic miscalculation, if, in forcing him to acknowledge his condition, she had instead driven him further into the walls of isolation he had so carefully constructed. But when Dr. Ashford was shown into the study, the Duke did not refuse him. And when Catherine, having lingered near the door with the deliberate transparency of someone who intended to be seen, was invited to remain, she understood that Sebastian had made his choice. "Your Grace, Doctor," Ashford said carefully, his keen eyes moving between the Duke and Catherine, with the assessment of a man who had been a family physician for decades and thus understood far more than what was being directly told to him. "The Duchess informs me that you are experiencing some difficulty with pain management. This is a matter I believe warrants discussion. The Duchess is interfering in matters that are not her concern," the Duke said flatly, but he did not ask Catherine to leave. On the contrary, Dr. Ashford said, settling himself into a chair with the comfort of long familiarity, I would argue that the Duchess is demonstrating the kind of concern that all marriages should contain. Now then, I have known you since you were a boy, Sebastian. I attended you after the accident. I am aware of the nature of your injury and the prognosis that was delivered at that time. What I am not aware of is the specifics of how you have been managing the subsequent years. The Duke was silent for a long moment. Catherine watched the conflict move across his features, the desire to maintain privacy warring with the exhaustion of years spent managing pain without assistance. The pain is constant, he said finally, his voice stripped of its usual careful control. The physicians said it would lessen with time. It has not. If anything, it has worsened, or I have simply lost the capacity to bear it with the same stoicism. And how are you currently managing this pain? Dr. Ashford asked. Laudanum, Catherine said quietly, when it became clear the Duke would not answer. Nightly, carefully measured but regular, and considerable will. Dr. Ashford looked at her, and she saw in his expression a moment of reassessment. The Duchess is remarkably well informed, he observed dryly. The Duchess is observant, the Duke said, and there was something almost like admiration in his tone, and intrusive, and utterly without respect for the boundaries that I have attempted to establish. Excellent qualities in a wife, I would say, Dr. Ashford replied. He turned his attention back to the Duke. Sebastian, I must examine you, not as a family friend, but as a physician. Will you permit this? What followed was an examination that seemed to Catherine to involve considerable pain on the Duke's part, though he maintained his composure throughout. Doctor, Ashford moved his hands along the spine, asked questions about sensation, about movement, about the precise nature and location of the pain, and when it was complete, he sat back in his chair with an expression that suggested he was considering something complex. The injury is severe, he said finally, more severe than I had initially understood. The scarring, the nerve damage, these are significant. However, I am not convinced that the current management strategy is optimal. What would you suggest? Catherine asked, since the Duke seemed disinclined to do so. Several things, Dr. Ashford said, directing his answer to both of them. First, the laudanum is not the most effective pain management for this type of chronic condition. There are newer treatments that have shown promise, specifically a combination of physical therapy, dietary adjustment, and a different class of medication that may provide more sustained relief without the sedative properties that laudanum carries. I have read extensively about such treatments, the Duke said quietly. They are experimental and expensive. They are, Dr. Ashford agreed. However, I suspect that expense is not your primary concern. Your primary concern is the experimentation aspect, the uncertainty of outcome. You prefer the known suffering of laudanum to the unknown possibilities of something new. Can you blame me? The Duke asked bitterly. I have endured 7 years of false hopes, of physicians who promised treatments that either did nothing or made the condition worse. I have learned that hope is a luxury I cannot afford. And yet, Dr. Ashford said gently, you continue to read the medical texts. You continue to search for understanding. You continue to get up each morning and manage your day despite considerable pain. That is not the behavior of a man who has given up. That is the behavior of a man whose hope is expressed through action rather than words. He stood and began to pack his medical bag. I shall recommend several physicians in London who specialize in this type of injury. I shall also provide you with the names of treatments worth investigating. You need not pursue any of this, but I encourage you to at least consider it. And perhaps, he glanced at Catherine, with the support of someone who has demonstrated that she is willing to confront difficult truths, the experimentation itself will be less daunting. After Dr. Ashford had departed, the Duke sat in silence for a long time. Catherine remained in the study, offering her presence without demanding his acknowledgement of it. You forced me to be seen, he said finally, his voice hollow. Yes, Catherine said simply. I did not want to be seen. I know. And yet you did it anyway. Yes, Catherine said again, because I could not bear to watch you disappear, because I married a man, not a ghost, and because somewhere beneath the pain and the laudanum and the walls of isolation there is someone worth knowing. I am betting my life on that assessment. He looked at her then, and she saw in his grey eyes something that might have been gratitude, or might have been fear, or might have been both. You are very brave, he said quietly. I am very foolish, Catherine corrected, but I am also very stubborn, and I am not leaving. That night they had dinner together as they always did, at opposite ends of a table that seemed suddenly less vast. And later, when Catherine heard the sound of suffering from the east wing, she did not remain in her chamber. Instead, she went to him. This time, when she knelt beside his chair, she did not remain at a distance. She took his hand, carefully, as though he were something precious that might break, and she held it as he fought with pain that Dr. Ashford's words had not yet alleviated. Together, she reminded him softly. And for the first time since his injury, the Duke of Ravensbrück allowed himself to be comforted, to be known, to be something other than a man managing suffering in solitude. The days that followed the visit from Dr. Ashford transformed the architecture of their marriage in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Sebastian began the process of investigating the treatments that Dr. Ashford had recommended, a process that involved consultations with physicians in London, the arrangement of apparatus designed to support his spine during the day, and a gradual reduction in his laudanum consumption in favor of a different medication that he himself began to research with renewed intensity. But more significantly, something shifted in the physical space between them. Catherine had begun to understand that the Duke's careful distance had not been merely emotional. It had been physical, rooted in his fear that his condition would repel her, that the manifestations of his pain would constitute a betrayal of the standards that made her his wife rather than his nurse. And so when he permitted her to hold his hand that night in the East Wing study, he had crossed a threshold that changed everything. It began with small gestures, his hand finding hers briefly at dinner before withdrawing, a moment where their shoulders nearly touched as they walked through the library, and he did not shift away. A night when Catherine sat beside his chair in the East Wing room and read poetry aloud while he listened, and neither of them mentioned the intimacy of this act. One evening, nearly a week after Dr. Ashford's visit, Catherine was alone in the library when the Duke found her. She was reading one of his medical texts, not the ones on spinal injury, but the older ones, philosophical treatises on the nature of suffering and healing. "You are still reading the books I forbade you to read," he observed, settling himself into a chair with the careful movements that had become familiar to her. "I am," Catherine said, looking up from her pages. "I find them fascinating, particularly the way the older physicians understood pain, not as a mechanical problem to be solved, but as an experience to be integrated into one's understanding of the self." "An interesting interpretation," he said. He was quiet for a moment, and then, "I have been thinking about what you said, about managing pain together. I am not certain that I know how to do this. To accept help, I mean. I have spent so long managing it alone." "Then we shall learn together," Catherine said simply. She set down the book and moved to sit near his chair. "Tell me what it is like. Not the clinical description of the pain, but what it is like to experience it." He was silent for so long that she wondered if he would answer. When he finally did, his voice was barely audible. "It is like carrying something very heavy that no one else can see," he said, "like being constantly aware of a weight that presses down on you, that limits your movement, that exhausts you, even when you are at rest. And the worst part, the part that I believe nearly destroyed me, was that no one else could see it, so I had to pretend that it was not there, that I was not being crushed by it." Catherine rose and moved to stand beside his chair. She did not touch him. She was learning the careful dance of when contact was permitted and when it would constitute a violation of his carefully managed space. "Will you allow me to see it?" she asked softly. "Will you stop pretending?" "If I stop pretending," he said, "then I must accept that this is my reality, that I am a man limited by injury, by pain, by the constraints of a body that no longer functions as it should. That is a difficult thing to accept." "Yes," Catherine agreed, "but perhaps it is less difficult than carrying it alone." She extended her hand, and this time when he took it, he did not immediately release. Instead, he held it, his thumb making small circles on her palm, a gesture so simple, so achingly tender, that it seemed to contain the entirety of what he had been unable to express in words. "Come," she said, "sit with me in the library, not in this room of solitude, but in the grand library where the light is better and where the world beyond these walls can still reach us." He hesitated, and she understood what he was thinking, that leaving the East Wing study would constitute an acknowledgement that he was permitting her to participate in his suffering rather than managing it in isolation, that it would be a surrender of the careful control he had maintained for 7 years. "Yes," she said, understanding his hesitation without him speaking it. "It is terrifying. Do it anyway." And so they moved, slowly, to the grand library. The Duke settled himself into one of the chairs near the window where afternoon light streamed in, and Catherine sat beside him, and for the first time they existed together not as a husband and wife maintaining the appearance of a marriage, but as two people allowing themselves to be known to each other. As the days passed, this became their rhythm. Mornings, they maintained perfect propriety in the breakfast room and the formal spaces of the house. But afternoons found them in the library, or in the morning room where Catherine had begun to set up a small workspace, and evenings found them in the East Wing study, where Catherine's presence had transformed the space from a chamber of solitary suffering into something approaching sanctuary. One particular evening, Catherine was massaging the muscles along the Duke's spine, a practice she had read about in the medical texts and which seemed to provide him with some relief when he asked her a question. "Why did you not fight harder when Constance brought my proposal to your family?" he asked quietly. "I've been wondering this for days. You had every right to refuse. Your mother would not have forced you into it. Why did you accept so readily?" Catherine paused in her movements. She was kneeling behind his chair, having learned that this position allowed her to work on his lower back without the intimacy of direct eye contact, which he found easier to discuss difficult matters. "Because," she said slowly, "I had spent my entire life being told that survival was enough, that if one could simply survive the day, manage the finances, avoid scandal, keep the household functioning, then one had achieved success. And I looked at my life, and I saw that I was excellent at survival, and I realized that I had never considered whether I wanted more than mere survival." She resumed her movements, feeling the gradual relaxation of muscles that were habitually tense. "When you came to us with your proposal, you offered something that I had not expected. You offered the possibility of a life beyond survival, a life with resources, with comfort, with the luxury of not having to constantly calculate whether I could afford to eat. Yes, the circumstances were strange. Yes, I barely knew you, but I also understood that the alternative was a life of genteel decline, watching my mother slowly disappear beneath the weight of poverty, until one day I would look up and realize that she was gone, and I had spent her entire life being too busy managing survival to actually know her." She moved her hands upward along his spine, feeling the deep scarring along his vertebral column, the tightness of muscles attempting to protect an injury they could never fully heal. "So I accepted your proposal. Not because I loved you, I did not, but because I understood that you were offering me something more valuable than love at that moment. You were offering me resources, time, the possibility of becoming something more than a woman, simply managing survival. And now?" he asked quietly. "Do you regret it?" "No," Catherine said with certainty, "though not for the reasons you might think. I do not regret it because I have found something I was not expecting. I have found someone beneath the Duke, beneath the title, beneath the careful control. I have found a man who is worth knowing, a man who is worth fighting for." She felt him shift slightly, turning to look at her. "You are not describing what most women would desire in a husband." "No," Catherine agreed. "Most women want comfort and security, and a man who is capable of appearing happy in public. I want those things too, but I also want something more. I want a man who is willing to let me see him, to let me help him, to let me matter beyond the purely functional aspects of marriage." She moved around his chair and knelt before him, her hands resting on his knees. In the candlelight, she could see the struggle on his face, the war between his desire for distance and his need for connection. "I will not leave you," she said quietly, "not because of the pain, not because of the limitations, not because of anything that exists or might exist in the future. I have chosen to stay. That choice, repeated every day, is the foundation of everything between us." He reached out and, with surprising gentleness, touched her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, the curve of her cheek, and she held very still, understanding that this was a significant moment, a moment in which he was allowing himself to touch her, not out of necessity, but out of connection. "I am afraid," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I know," Catherine whispered. "So am I, but we are afraid together. That is better than being afraid alone." 2 weeks into their marriage, Catherine discovered that the East Wing was not the only space in Ravensbrook House that the Duke had claimed for his private use. There was also a garden, small, overlooked, accessible only from the corridor adjacent to his private study. It was winter, so the garden was largely barren, but it was also beautiful in its austerity, with evergreen plants and skeletal trees arranged in a way that suggested someone had spent considerable thought on its composition. When Catherine found it, she understood immediately that this was another sacred space, a place where the Duke had come to exist when the house felt too constraining, when the weight of maintaining his carefully constructed facade became too much to bear alone. She began to leave him there. Not physically. She would return to the house, to the ordinary tasks of being Duchess, but in her mind she left him space to exist in that garden without her observation, without her attempts to comfort or to fix or to be present. She understood that healing was not something that could be rushed, that trust was not something that could be demanded, that love, if that was what was growing between them, needed to develop according to its own timeline, not according to her desires for it. But she did begin to join him there. In the late afternoons when the light was beginning to fade, she would come quietly, bringing tea or sometimes simply sitting nearby while he stood at the edge of the garden, looking out toward the grounds beyond. And gradually, without either of them explicitly deciding that this would happen, the garden became a space where their marriage began to take on a reality it had not previously possessed. It was in this garden, on a particularly clear afternoon when the winter sun was sharp and brilliant, that the Duke finally told her the truth about why he had selected her. They were standing near a low stone wall that marked the boundary between the garden and the grounds beyond. Catherine had been speaking about a book she was reading, something by a contemporary author that explored the nature of resilience in women who had endured hardship. She had not been speaking to him directly, but simply voicing her thoughts which had become a pattern between them. "It was not actually you," he said suddenly, interrupting her mid-sentence. "Originally, when I decided that I must marry, it was not you I was considering." Catherine turned to look at him unsurprised. She had suspected this for some time, that his initial selection of her had been based on something external, something circumstantial, something other than the careful assessment of her character that she had witnessed him conduct. "I was approached by Lord Edward," the Duke continued, his gaze fixed on the barren garden before them. "My cousin. He came to me with a proposition. He suggested that I marry a woman of no particular consequence, someone from a family of no particular rank, someone who would be grateful for the elevation to Duchess, and thus unlikely to question my authority or my limitations. He suggested a woman who would be easy to control, easy to manage, easy to position as the beneficiary of my generosity." Catherine felt her heart slow. This was a revelation she had not been expecting, that his selection of her had not been random or instinctive, but had been suggested by someone else, that she had, in essence, been selected by committee. "And you agreed?" she asked carefully. "I was considering it," he said. "I was not particularly inclined toward marriage, you understand that. But the title requires an heir, and I was sufficiently aware of my mortality to recognize that the matter could not be endlessly delayed. So when Edward suggested this option, I listened. He even provided me with a selection of candidates. And how did I come to be selected from this list?" Catherine asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "You were not," the Duke said. "You were not on the list at all. But when Edward took me to meet the Whitmore family, when he stood in that drawing room and looked at you with the kind of assessment that I had learned to recognize, I understood that his true purpose was not to facilitate a convenient marriage for me. His true purpose was to identify women who might be vulnerable, who might be more easily controlled, who might be more easily discarded should I prove inconvenient." He turned to look at her then, and she saw the anger there, not directed at her but at himself, at Edward, at the circumstances that had made such arrangements seem necessary. "And I realized in that moment," he continued, "that everything Edward had suggested about the woman I should marry was precisely wrong. He wanted me to marry someone I could control. I needed to marry someone who would not be controlled. He wanted me to marry someone who would accept the lie of this marriage. I needed to marry someone who would demand the truth of it." "So you selected me as an act of defiance," Catherine said quietly. "I selected you as an act of self-preservation," he corrected. "If I was to be trapped in a marriage, and yes, in many ways this is a trap, though one I have walked into willingly, then I needed it to be with someone who would not allow me to trap myself further. Edward wanted a wife I could hide from. I needed a wife I could not hide from." Catherine considered this revelation. It changed nothing, she realized, and yet it changed everything. The Duke had not selected her out of any assessment of her merit, not initially. He had selected her in opposition to someone else's designs, in defiance of someone else's suggestions for how she should be. But he had been right. In selecting her as an act of opposition, he had accidentally selected exactly the person he needed. "What happened to your cousin?" Catherine asked. "In response to your selection of me?" "He was displeased," the Duke said dryly. He had other plans for the wealth and position that a convenient marriage would have afforded him. He had begun to position himself as the possible heir to the title, in the event that my pain and my health limitations eventually proved too much. My marriage to someone of no particular consequence but considerable determination, complicated his calculations significantly. "Is he a threat?" Catherine asked, understanding that this was an important question. "Not directly," the Duke said, "but he is a man accustomed to getting what he wants, and what he wants currently is leverage over my medical decisions, over my household, over you." "Why me?" Catherine asked. "Because," the Duke said quietly, "he believes that if he can compromise you, he can compromise me. If he can position himself as your protector, your confidant, your champion against my control, then he can create divisions in this household that serve his purposes." Catherine felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold. She was beginning to understand the complexity of the marriage she had entered into. It was not merely a marriage of convenience. It was a marriage that existed within a complex web of family politics, financial interests, and struggles for control. "He will not succeed," she said with certainty. The Duke looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something approaching a smile move across his features. "No," he agreed, "I do not believe he will, because you are not easily manipulated, and you are not interested in leverage or control, and because," he paused, seeming to struggle with the next words, "because you have already demonstrated that you are willing to remain in a situation that is difficult, uncomfortable, and often painful. You are not going to abandon it because of pressure from someone like Edward." "No," Catherine agreed, "I'm not going to abandon it, but neither am I going to allow someone to use this marriage, or you or me, for their own purposes. If Edward is a threat, then we must address that threat directly." "And how do you propose we do that?" the Duke asked. Catherine smiled. "By being honest," she said simply, "by refusing to hide, by allowing the world to see that this marriage, despite its unconventional beginning, is real, that I am not a woman in distress requiring rescue from your control, but a woman who has chosen to stay, repeatedly. That is a more powerful defense than any scheme Edward could construct." The Duke reached out and took her hand. In the fading afternoon light, his face was softened by shadow and by something else, something that might have been relief, or might have been the beginning of something deeper. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. "I am surviving," Catherine corrected. "And this time survival is not a limitation, it is an achievement." As they walked back into the house, Catherine understood that the marriage she had entered into was not what she had expected. It was more complicated, more dangerous, more real, but it was also more meaningful than any marriage of simple convenience could have been. And as the Duke released her hand at the threshold between the garden and the house, the necessary maintenance of distance, the careful preservation of propriety, Catherine understood that this marriage was going to require not just her presence, but her courage. She was beginning to understand that she had it to give. Lord Edward Ravensbrook arrived at Ravensbrook House on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after Catherine's marriage, with the confident bearing of someone who believed himself to be the primary occupant of the residence rather than a visitor. His carriage pulled up to the entrance with theatrical precision, and within moments he was being shown into the drawing room, where Catherine sat reviewing the household accounts, a task she had quietly assumed from the steward, who had seemed grateful to relinquish the responsibility. "My cousin has married," Edward announced, his smile containing more predation than warmth, "and to such a charming woman. The scandal sheets have been positively languishing without more details. You must tell me everything, dear Catherine. May I call you Catherine? I feel that after such an extraordinary event we must dispense with formality." Catherine set down her pen with deliberate care. She had been expecting Edward since the Duke had warned her of his likely arrival. She had also spent the intervening days preparing for precisely this moment. "You may call me Duchess," Catherine said calmly, looking up from her accounts. "Your Grace and I prefer to maintain certain standards regarding the use of given names. I trust you understand." She saw the flash of irritation cross his features before his smile reasserted itself. Edward was conventionally handsome in a way that seemed carefully cultivated, his blonde hair perfectly arranged, his clothing expensive and fashionable, his manners polished to a degree that suggested considerable practice. Yet beneath the facade, Catherine could see what the Duke had described, a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and not particularly burdened by conscience regarding the methods he employed to achieve it. "Of course," Edward said, settling himself into a chair without being invited to do so. "Though I confess I am curious about this most extraordinary marriage." Sebastian is not a man given to romantic impulse. When he informed me that he had selected a wife, I was astonished. And when I discovered that the wife in question was Miss Catherine Whitmore, a young woman of no particular fortune or connection, I confess myself utterly bewildered. "How fortunate that you have come to satisfy your bewilderment," Catherine said, returning her attention to her accounts. "I am certain the Duke will be delighted to explain his reasoning to you himself." "I am certain he will," Edward agreed, though something in his tone suggested that he expected no such explanation. "However, I thought it might be valuable to speak with you first, woman to woman, as it were, to understand what circumstances might have led a young woman of your circumstances to accept such an extraordinary proposal from a man who, I think we must be honest, is not entirely suitable as a husband." Catherine's pen paused. She did not look up from her accounts, but she felt the shift in the room, the moment when Edward had revealed his true purpose. "The Duke is eminently suitable," Catherine said calmly. "I cannot imagine why you would suggest otherwise." "Can you not?" Edward leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone that was almost conspiratorial. "My dear Catherine, Sebastian is a man in considerable pain. Chronic pain, I might add, that is unlikely to diminish and may well worsen as he ages. He is also a man whose judgment has been compromised by years of laudanum consumption and experimental treatments. I have seen it myself, the deterioration, the increasing isolation, and now he has married you, a woman who was utterly dependent upon his charity, with no family of consequence to protect your interests should circumstances change." Catherine finally looked up from her accounts. She allowed her eyes to meet his directly, and she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Are you suggesting," she said slowly, "that I married the Duke under false pretenses? That I am somehow a victim in this situation who requires protection?" "I am suggesting," Edward said, his smile becoming almost tender, "that you are a woman of considerable intelligence, trapped in a marriage that will become increasingly difficult as Sebastian's condition deteriorates. I am suggesting that you might benefit from having an ally, someone who understands the family, who has your best interests in mind, who could perhaps help you navigate the complexities that are certain to arise. And in exchange for this alliance," Catherine said, understanding now the precise nature of his manipulation, "I would provide you with leverage over your cousin. I would become a spy within the household, reporting on his condition, his medical decisions, his finances." "Not a spy," Edward said, looking wounded. "An ally, someone who helps me protect the family interests, someone who ensures that Sebastian is not being taken advantage of by physicians or charlatans offering false hope, someone who perhaps helps ensure that his medical decisions are being made in the best interest of his health, not merely in the interest of his pride." Catherine set down her pen with absolute finality. She stood, and she watched as Edward rose as well, good manners overriding his surprise at being dismissed. "Lord Edward," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of her position as Duchess, "I will speak plainly because I believe you are intelligent enough to understand plainness. I married your cousin of my own volition. I am not a victim. I do not require your protection or your alliance, and I will never provide you with the leverage you seek over him. Furthermore, if you attempt to manipulate me again, if you attempt to position yourself as my champion or my confidant, I will ensure that the Duke is aware of the specifics of this conversation and of your intentions." She moved to the bell pull and rang it with deliberate authority. "I believe your carriage is ready. Mrs. Graves will see you out." "You are making a mistake," Edward said quietly as he moved toward the door. "Sebastian's condition will worsen. His pain will increase. Eventually he will require medication so substantial that he will no longer be capable of managing the estate or the title. When that time comes, you will wish that you had allied yourself with someone who could help you. You will wish that you had considered your own future." "Perhaps," Catherine said coldly, "but I will not wish it enough to betray your cousin. Remove yourself from this house, Lord Edward, and do not return unless you are summoned by the Duke himself." After he had departed, Catherine remained standing in the drawing room, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. She had expected Edward to be manipulative. She had not expected to discover how deep the manipulation ran, how thoroughly he had calculated the vulnerabilities of her position. When the Duke found her an hour later, still standing in the drawing room, her accounts forgotten on the desk, he understood immediately that something had occurred. "Edward," Catherine said without preamble, "he came. He attempted to recruit me as an ally against you. He suggested that your condition will worsen, that I will eventually regret the marriage, that I should position myself for a future that does not involve you." She watched as the Duke's expression shifted, not with surprise but with resignation, as though this was exactly what he had expected from his cousin. "And what did you tell him?" the Duke asked quietly. "I told him that I refused his alliance, that I would never betray you, that he was to leave and not return unless summoned by you." Catherine paused. "I also told him that I would inform you of his intentions if he attempted to manipulate me again." The Duke moved to her and, with surprising gentleness, took her trembling hands in his own. "You were extraordinary," he said quietly, "and you were also foolish. Edward will not forgive being rejected so completely. He will escalate. He will attempt other approaches, other manipulations. You have made yourself his enemy." "I was already his enemy," Catherine said. "I married you. That was sufficient to make me an obstacle to his designs. At least now he knows that I understand what he intends." The Duke brought her hands to his lips and kissed them, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that it seemed to contain an entire lifetime of gratitude. "You are not what I expected when I selected you," he said quietly, "for you are considerably better." The confrontation with Edward seemed to crystallize something in Catherine's relationship with the Duke. The pretense that theirs was merely a marriage of convenience dissolved almost entirely, replaced by something more complex, more real, and infinitely more dangerous. For how could one protect oneself from someone who was slowly becoming essential to one's existence? That evening, they did not occupy separate spaces. Instead, Catherine found herself in the Duke's private study, a room she had entered only once or twice before, a space that existed at the border between his public world and his utterly private one. He was reading by candlelight when she entered, a medical text open on his lap, his expression distant and contemplative. "I have been thinking about what Edward said," Catherine began without preamble, "about your condition worsening, about the increasing reliance on medication. How much of what he described is accurate?" The Duke looked up from his text. "To what end?" he asked carefully. "Do you ask because you believe I am deceiving you about the trajectory of my condition? Or do you ask because you are beginning to contemplate the future that Edward suggested?" "I ask because I need to understand," Catherine said firmly. She moved to sit in the chair across from his own, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke to years of pain management. "Not because I am contemplating abandoning you, but because I cannot protect what I do not understand, and I find that I am very interested in protecting you." He was silent for a long moment. Then he closed the medical text and set it aside with deliberate care. "The prognosis is not optimistic," he said finally. "The initial injury 7 years ago was severe. The intervening years have seen only minimal improvement. The nerve damage that occurred is, in the assessment of every physician I have consulted, largely permanent. As I age, the pain typically becomes more severe rather than less. The medications that currently provide some relief may become less effective over time. It is entirely possible, indeed probable, that within 5 to 10 years I will be considerably more limited than I am now." Catherine absorbed this information with the steady understanding of someone who had already accepted the fundamental uncertainty of life. "And if that occurs," she said quietly, "if you become more dependent on medication, more limited in your mobility, what then? What happens to the title, to the estates, to the responsibility of being Duke?" "The title is not something one can simply relinquish," the Duke said with bitter precision. "It carries forward regardless of one's capacity to execute its functions. It is entirely possible that I will eventually require someone to assist me in managing the estate, a secretary of some kind, or a man of business. It is possible that I will become increasingly isolated, increasingly reliant on medication, increasingly removed from the functioning of my own title. Then we shall prepare for that possibility," Catherine said calmly. "We shall ensure that you have the support you require. We shall arrange matters so that your authority is preserved even as your physical capacity diminishes. We shall not wait for catastrophe to force adaptation." The Duke looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You are discussing this as though it is a manageable problem, as though it is something to be solved rather than something to be despaired over." "Because that is precisely what it is," Catherine said. "You have spent 7 years convincing yourself that your condition is a tragedy to be endured in isolation. Edward has spent those same 7 years waiting for that tragedy to become catastrophic enough that he can step into your position. I have no interest in either of these narratives. I have an interest in ensuring that you continue to have a life worth living, regardless of the physical limitations that may accompany it." She rose from her chair and moved to kneel before him, a position she had taken before but which never ceased to carry significance. "Tell me about the medical treatments that Dr. Ashford mentioned," she said. "Tell me about the experimental approaches that you have been researching in secret. Tell me everything." And so he did. For hours, they discussed the various treatments he had investigated, some promising, some ultimately ineffective, all of them representing his desperate attempt to reverse or mitigate an injury that would not yield to reversal or mitigation. Catherine listened without judgment, asking questions when his explanations became too technical, offering observations when insight might be valuable. By the time they finished, it was nearly dawn, and Catherine understood with clarity what the Duke had been attempting all these years. He had been trying to fix himself, to become the person he had been before the injury, and in doing so, he had been unable to accept that he might be valuable despite the injury, not in spite of it. "Sebastian," she said as the first light of morning began to creep through the windows, "what if the goal is not to cure yourself, but to optimize the life you can have within the constraints of your condition?" He looked at her, and she saw the question in his eyes, the fundamental uncertainty about whether such a life would be worth living. "I believe it would be," she said quietly, understanding his unspoken doubt. "I believe that a life lived with acceptance and adaptation can contain more meaning than a life spent in constant pursuit of an impossible cure. I believe that you are more than your injury, and that once you accept this, you may discover that there is more to your life than the management of pain. And if I cannot accept it," he asked, his voice barely audible, "then I will accept it for you," Catherine said simply, "until you are ready, for as long as necessary." She took his face in her hands, an act of such intimacy that it seemed to bypass the careful boundaries they maintained, and she kissed him. Not with passion, though passion was not entirely absent. She kissed him with determination, with commitment, with the absolute certainty of someone who had made a choice and intended to see it through. When she released him, she saw tears on his cheeks, though she could not determine whether they were tears of grief for what he had lost, or tears of relief at finally being seen clearly by someone who would not look away. "Come to bed," she said, extending her hand. "Not to sleep, not yet, just come, let me hold you. Let us exist together without all the careful distance, without all the walls. Just for this morning, before the day requires us to resume our performance of propriety." And he took her hand, and he followed her from his study, through the darkened corridors of Ravensbrook House to the Duchess's chambers, a space they had maintained carefully separate until this moment. And as the sun rose on this new day, Catherine understood that something fundamental had shifted in their marriage. It was no longer an arrangement of convenience. It was no longer a carefully maintained distance. It was becoming, however slowly and carefully, something that might be called love. The week following Catherine's arrival in the Duke's most private world was a week of adjustment on both sides. The Duke had spent so long managing his suffering in isolation that permitting Catherine to witness it required a fundamental shift in his understanding of what was acceptable, what was dignified, what was safe. There was a night, 3 days after they had begun to share the Duchess's chambers, when Catherine discovered precisely how severe the pain could become. She had been reading in the sitting room while the Duke rested, believing that he was sleeping, when she heard the sound from the bedchamber, a sound so raw, so utterly devoid of the careful control that typically defined him, that she understood immediately that something had changed. She found him in the darkness, his body rigid with pain so profound that it seemed to be consuming him entirely from the inside. The medication he had taken earlier was insufficient, overwhelmed by something that had built throughout the day, a crisis of pain rather than the usual chronic ache. "Sebastian," she said, moving to him, "let me help." "There is nothing to be done," he managed through gritted teeth. "This is simply what it is. This is the reality that I have been attempting to hide from everyone, including myself. This is the future that Edward promises will only increase." Catherine did not waste time on soothing words or false comfort. Instead, she moved with practical purpose. She sent for hot water, for clean linens, for the laudanum that Dr. Ashford had suggested be kept available for such crises. She positioned pillows to support his spine. She applied heat to the most painful areas. She sat with him through the long hours of the night while he fought with pain that seemed almost sentient in its determination to destroy him. And when, finally, as the sun began to rise, the worst of it passed and he collapsed into an exhausted sleep, Catherine remained awake, understanding that she had just witnessed something essential about the man she had married. She had witnessed the thing he most feared, not death, not disability, but the loss of control. The moment when the careful facade he maintained crumbled entirely. When he woke, perhaps an hour later, the first thing he said was, "You remained." "Of course I remained," Catherine said quietly. She was sitting in the chair beside the bed, watching him with an expression he could not quite interpret. "Where else would I be? You could have retreated to your own chambers. You could have rung for Dr. Ashford. You could have done any number of things that would have been more reasonable than sitting through the night with a man in the grip of agony." "Yes," Catherine said, "I could have done any of those things. I did not, because I am your wife and I choose to be present for you, even especially in moments like this, perhaps most importantly, in moments like this." She rose and moved to the bed, settling herself beside him with careful attention, not to jostle his injured spine. "I want you to understand something," she said quietly. "What you experienced last night, the loss of control, the rawness of it, this is not a weakness. This is not something to be ashamed of. This is the reality of living with chronic pain, and I am not going anywhere because of it." "Catherine," he said, his voice hoarse from the night's suffering, "you cannot know what this future holds. You cannot know if you will be able to bear it." "No," she agreed, "I cannot know the future, but I know the present. I know that you are a man of considerable strength and dignity. I know that you are attempting to live with circumstances that would crush most people. I know that I love you even when, especially when, your carefully constructed facade crumbles and reveals the struggling human beneath." She had not meant to say it. The words had simply emerged, and once they were in the air between them, they could not be taken back. She watched as his expression transformed, watched as something fundamental shifted in the space between them. "Do you understand what you are saying?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Catherine said with absolute certainty. "I am saying that I love you, not the Duke, not the man who offered me security and a position in society, not the man I married for convenience and survival. I love you, this man, here, now, in this moment of vulnerability. I love you despite the pain, because of the pain, in the spaces where the pain reveals who you truly are beneath all the careful construction." He reached for her, and his hands shook as he drew her close. He did not speak, because there were no words adequate to contain what was moving through him. Instead, he simply held her, with a tenderness that spoke to the profound significance of being known, of being loved, of being allowed to exist without the burden of maintaining a facade. They remained there as the morning progressed, neither of them willing to move, both of them understanding that they had just crossed a threshold that would change everything about their marriage. This was no longer an arrangement. This was no longer a carefully managed distance. This was love, raw and real and utterly vulnerable. When eventually Catherine rose to ring for fresh water and clean linens, the Duke caught her hand. "I love you," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something essential, as though he was giving her a part of himself that he had protected for years. "I believe I have loved you since the moment I saw you in that drawing room, though I was too afraid and too proud to acknowledge it. I love you with every part of myself that is not consumed by pain, and that is a considerable portion." Catherine turned back and kissed him, gently, carefully, aware that his body was still tender from the night's crisis, but needing to seal this moment with the physical confirmation of her commitment. "Then we shall love each other," she said, "and we shall face whatever comes together. That is all any person can ask." The following day brought Dr. Ashford back to Ravensbrook House. The Duke had requested his presence without Catherine's knowledge, wanting to understand what had transpired the night before, wanting to ensure that similar crises could be managed with greater effectiveness. What resulted was a conversation that transformed their understanding of his condition. "What you experienced, Doctor," Ashford explained, "is something that occurs periodically with spinal injuries of this severity. The body builds up tension and pressure, and when the release finally comes, it can be profound. However, it is also something that can be mitigated through regular physical therapy, through specific dietary adjustments, through a more carefully calibrated medication schedule." "In other words," the Duke said, "you are suggesting that my years of attempting to manage this through will alone have been ineffective, that I have been prolonging my own suffering unnecessarily." "I am suggesting," Dr. Ashford said gently, "that chronic pain requires a comprehensive approach. It requires the body, the mind, and the spirit to work together toward management rather than toward a cure. It requires acceptance alongside adaptation. And it requires," he looked at Catherine, "the support of people who love you and are willing to learn the complexities of your condition alongside you." After the physician had departed, Catherine and the Duke sat together in the library, and they began to plan. They consulted with specialists in London. They arranged for physical therapy equipment to be brought to Ravensbrook House. They worked with Dr. Ashford to develop a medication schedule that would prevent the build-up that led to crisis, while not rendering the Duke unable to function. And slowly, painstakingly, they began to construct a life that was not about managing pain in isolation, but about integrating pain management into a shared existence. It was, Catherine would later reflect, not a cure, but it was something better. It was the beginning of acceptance. Edward's next move came not through direct confrontation, but through the channels that had always served him best: gossip, insinuation, and the careful manipulation of social perception. Catherine first became aware of it through a call from her mother, who arrived at Ravensbrook House on a grey afternoon, looking considerably more distressed than Catherine had seen her in months. "There are rumours," her mother said without preamble, settling herself in the morning room with trembling hands. "About you, about the Duke, about the nature of this marriage. Aunt Constance has been speaking to people, saying that you accepted the Duke out of desperation rather than genuine regard, that your position is unstable because of his condition, that the marriage is merely a transaction that could be dissolved if he determines it no longer serves his interests." Catherine set down her teacup with deliberate care. She had been expecting something like this. Edward would not attack directly. That was not his method. He would poison the social environment, cast doubt on the legitimacy of the marriage, and trust that the cumulative effect of whispered suspicions would eventually undermine her position. "And what have you said in response?" Catherine asked calmly. "I have defended you, of course," her mother said. "I have told people that this marriage is legitimate, that you are the Duchess, that your position is secure. But, Catherine, I confess that I am concerned. The nature of these rumors, they suggest a campaign of deliberate destruction. Someone is orchestrating this." "Edward," Catherine said simply, "the Duke's cousin. He attempted to recruit me as an ally against the Duke. When I refused, he escalated to this, to attempting to undermine my position through social pressure." She rose and moved to the window, looking out at the grey afternoon. "He is clever," she continued. "He understands that if he can make people question the legitimacy of my position, if he can suggest that I am not truly a duchess, but merely a woman who married a damaged man for money, then he can create instability. And instability serves his purposes." "What purposes?" her mother asked. "Surely he cannot think that he could inherit. The Duke's position is established. His title is secure. But his health is questioned," Catherine said slowly, understanding Edward's logic as she spoke. "And if his health becomes sufficiently compromised, if he is perceived as incapable of managing the estates, if the authority of the Duchess, his wife, is undermined, then perhaps the family and the courts might begin to consider whether someone with greater capacity should manage the affairs of the title. Edward positions himself as that person." She turned back to her mother. "I must speak with the Duke. And then I believe it is time that I became considerably more public about the legitimacy of this marriage." The Duke received this news with an expression of such controlled fury that Catherine understood the depth of his attachment to her, for his anger was not directed at her for being vulnerable to Edward's attacks, but at Edward for daring to assault the woman he loved. "We shall counter this campaign," he said with absolute certainty, "and we shall do so publicly." What ensued was a transformation of the Duke's public appearance. For years he had been largely absent from society, maintaining his privacy and his distance, but now he began to appear, carefully, deliberately, but unmistakably present. He attended a dinner in London, appearing at Catherine's side in public for the first time since their wedding. He attended a ball, where he danced once with Catherine, a slow waltz that demonstrated both his affection for her and his physical capability. And most significantly, he granted an interview to the editor of a prominent society publication in which he discussed the legitimacy of his marriage, the genuine regard in which he held his wife, and his intention to remain actively involved in the management of his estates and titles for the foreseeable future. "My marriage to the Duchess was not a matter of convenience," he said, the words carefully constructed, but utterly sincere. "It was a deliberate choice based on the recognition that here was a woman of uncommon intelligence, uncommon courage, and uncommon integrity. My wife has made it clear that she intends to be an active partner in the management of this household and these estates. Any suggestion that her position is unstable is a suggestion without foundation." The interview created a sensation. Within days, the whispers had shifted. Catherine was no longer a woman of questionable position, but a woman of uncommon strength. The Duke was no longer a man isolated by his condition, but a man capable of recognizing and appreciating the value of genuine partnership. Edward responded by disappearing. He ceased his calls to the household, he ceased his whispered campaigns. And when 2 weeks later, he sent a brief note to the Duke expressing his intention to establish residence in the country and remain there indefinitely, everyone understood what it meant. Edward had lost. He had attempted to undermine the marriage from within, and when that failed, he had attempted to poison it from without. And he had failed in both instances, because what he had not anticipated was that the marriage he was attempting to destroy had, through crisis and vulnerability and the radical act of being truly known by another person, become unshakable. That evening, Catherine and the Duke celebrated quietly in the garden, the small private space that had become sacred to them. The winter was beginning to soften, and early spring flowers were emerging from the cold earth. "He will not trouble us again," the Duke said with the certainty of someone who understood his cousin's calculations. "No," Catherine agreed. "He has learned that I am not vulnerable to manipulation, and you are not vulnerable to the suggestion that you are incapable. He will find his opportunities elsewhere." "And you?" the Duke asked. "Do you feel as though you have truly been established as Duchess, as a woman of her own position, rather than a woman who married for convenience?" Catherine smiled. "I feel," she said carefully, "as though I have moved from a marriage of convenience to a marriage of genuine partnership. I feel as though I am no longer surviving but living, and I feel as though I have earned the right to call you mine, not through marriage contract but through choice, repeatedly, every single day." The Duke pulled her close, and they stood in the garden as the last light of day faded from the sky. Two people who had begun as strangers and had become, through the alchemy of genuine connection, partners in the truest sense. By the end of the 4th month of their marriage, Catherine and the Duke had constructed something that neither of them had believed possible when they first met. A marriage that functioned, simultaneously, as a public performance of propriety and a private reality of genuine intimacy. The public marriage was one of careful arrangement. They appeared together at select events. They maintained the proper distance in public spaces. They presented the image of a Duke and Duchess, executing their roles with appropriate gravity. But the private marriage, the marriage that existed in the early morning hours when Catherine would wake to find Sebastian already awake, managing pain through breathing and will before the household stirred, that was something altogether different. It was Catherine who first began to notice that something had shifted in his physical condition. It was subtle, small things that suggested improvement, rather than the relentless deterioration that had characterized the previous 7 years. The nights of crisis had become fewer. The morning pain, while still present, seemed to require less medication to manage. And most significantly, the isolation that had defined him seemed to be gradually releasing its grip. "Dr. Ashford suggests that the combination of the physical therapy, the dietary adjustments, and the medication modifications have had a genuine effect," Sebastian said one morning, reading from a letter that had arrived from the physician. "He writes that, while the damage itself cannot be reversed, the compensatory mechanisms we have developed may actually be allowing my body to function more efficiently. He suggests that continued application of these methods might yield further improvement." Catherine set down her breakfast and looked at her husband with the full force of her attention. "Are you saying," she asked carefully, "that the pain may continue to decrease, that your condition may continue to improve?" "I am saying," Sebastian replied, "that hope which I believed I had relinquished entirely may not have been a luxury I needed to surrender. And I am saying that this hope is inextricably tied to you, to your refusal to accept my narrative of inevitable decline, to your insistence that adaptation is possible, to your presence when the pain is worst." He set down the letter and reached for her hand. "I have been thinking," he continued, "about the future in a way that I had not allowed myself to do before, not as a theoretical exercise in managing decline, but as an actual possibility with actual parameters. I have been thinking about children." Catherine felt her breath catch. They had not discussed this, had maintained through some unspoken agreement a kind of careful distance from the implications of their marriage beyond the present moment. "Are you asking me," she said slowly, "whether I would be willing to bear your children?" "I am asking," Sebastian said, "whether you would be willing to build with me something that extends beyond this moment, beyond this crisis, beyond even the two of us. So I am asking whether you would be willing to create a future that contains not just survival, but actual generational continuity." "You are asking," Catherine said with perfect clarity, "whether I am truly committed to this marriage, or whether I will eventually leave when circumstances become more difficult." "Yes," Sebastian said simply, "that is precisely what I am asking." Catherine rose from the breakfast table and moved to stand before him. She had learned over the months that some moments required physical presence rather than words. "I will have your children," she said quietly. "I will bear your heirs. I will build with you a household and a legacy and a future that contains more than just the two of us. But I will do this not because I am trapped in this marriage, not because I lack alternatives, but because I choose to. Because every single day when I wake beside you, when I see you manage pain with courage, when I witness you gradually reconstructing a life that you believed was destroyed, every single day I choose to remain, and every single day I choose to deepen that commitment." She knelt before him as she had done so many times before, but this time the gesture contained something different. This time it contained not merely comfort or support, but the profound declaration of a woman binding herself to a man with full knowledge of what that binding might entail. "I love you," she said, "not because your condition is improving, not because the future is becoming more certain, not because your pain is becoming more manageable. I love you because you are you, this man, here, now, with all of your imperfections and your struggles and your extraordinary capacity to endure. I love the man you are, and I will love the man you become. That is my commitment." Sebastian drew her up and held her, and Catherine felt the tension that had defined him since the injury. Not just the physical tension of pain management, but the emotional tension of isolation, gradually begin to release. Over the following weeks, they began to discuss the practical aspects of children. Would the Duke's pain be a barrier? Would his medications compromise fertility? What would be the implications for Catherine's health? These were not romantic questions, but they were necessary ones, the kind of practical engagement with reality that separated genuine partnership from mere sentiment. Dr. Ashford was consulted. He provided his assessment that children were not only possible but likely, provided certain precautions were taken regarding the Duke's pain management during particularly vulnerable periods. He suggested that Catherine, while young and healthy, should be prepared for the typical difficulties of pregnancy and childbirth, though he saw no reason to believe that the Duke's condition would create additional complications. And so they began to plan. Not in the abstract way that people plan distant futures, but with genuine intention. Sebastian began to spend more time with the estate steward, ensuring that he understood all aspects of the management of the properties, knowing that he might eventually need to delegate more actively. Catherine began to establish herself more firmly within the household, learning the preferences and personalities of the staff, understanding the intricate web of relationships that constituted the functioning of a large estate. It was during this period of planning that Catherine discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for nearly 2 weeks before she confirmed it, waiting for the secondary indicators, for the absolute certainty that would allow her to make the announcement without fear of misstatement. But when the certainty came, it came with a force that seemed to rearrange the entire structure of her understanding of the future. She told Sebastian in the garden, in the small private space that had become the repository of all their most significant conversations. Spring had fully arrived now, and the garden was alive with new growth. Bulbs returning from dormancy, shrubs putting forth new leaves, the earth itself seeming to pulse with regeneration. "We are going to have a child," she said simply, watching his face as the words settled into him. She watched as his expression transformed, watched as joy moved across his features, complicated by fear, by awe, by the weight of what a child would mean. A heir, continuity, a future that extended beyond himself. "A child," he repeated, as though the word required multiple utterances to become real. Our child, Catherine confirmed. He pulled her close with surprising strength, and she felt him tremble, whether from pain or emotion, or the overwhelming intensity of the moment. She could not determine. "I have been given a second chance," he said quietly. "I did not believe this possible. I did not believe that a man as damaged as I am could be granted such a gift. And yet here you stand carrying my heir, having chosen me despite everything, having loved me past the point where it would have been reasonable to love me." "You are not damaged," Catherine said firmly. "You are transformed. The injury changed you. Yes, it changed the trajectory of your life, but you have used that transformation to become a better man than you might have been otherwise. You have learned compassion through suffering. You have learned resilience through pain. You have learned the value of genuine connection through the years you spent isolated. She took his hands and placed them on her still flat belly. This child will not inherit a damaged legacy, she continued. This child will inherit the legacy of a man who endured, who adapted, who loved with the full force of his being. This child will inherit the example of a marriage built not on convenience or social obligation, but on genuine partnership and mutual respect. Sebastian closed his eyes, and Catherine understood that he was allowing himself finally to believe in the future they had been constructing together, to believe that the man he had thought himself, a man whose value had been destroyed by injury, whose life had been ended even as his body continued to function, was wrong. That his value had not been destroyed, but had instead been transformed into something deeper, something more meaningful, something that could only be expressed through the creation of new life with a woman who had chosen to remain. "I will build this future with you," he said quietly. "I will be the father to our child that I did not believe it possible to be. I will give our son or daughter the example of a marriage based on genuine love. I will show them that damage does not define a person, that pain does not negate value, that transformation is not destruction." And there, in the garden at the moment of spring, they made their promises not merely to each other, but to the future they would create together. A future that had seemed impossible at the beginning, but which was now not merely possible but real. The 5th month of Catherine's pregnancy brought with it a transformation that was visible not just in the softening of her body, but in the way she inhabited the world. She carried the pregnancy as she had carried everything else in her marriage, with a combination of courage, pragmatism, and the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that her own strength was worth relying upon. The Duke, however, underwent a transformation of his own. His protective instincts, which had been expressed through distance and careful management, found new channels. He became intensely concerned with every aspect of Catherine's health and comfort. He consulted with midwives regarding the safest practices for pregnancy and childbirth. He read extensively about the nutrition required for a growing child, and most significantly, he began to participate in the household preparation in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. "So you are building a cradle," Catherine said one afternoon, finding him in the small workshop that had been established in the East Wing, working with his own hands alongside a craftsman brought from London. "I am ensuring that my child will have proper furnishings," Sebastian replied, though his attention remained focused on the delicate carving he was executing. The cradle was beautiful, mahogany, with intricate designs that suggested considerable patience and unexpected artistic sensibility. Every significant piece of furniture in this house was created by someone else, purchased with someone else's labor. For this, I wanted my hand to be involved. Catherine moved closer and watched as he worked. The physical effort seemed to cost him. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful management of his spine as he leaned over the work, but there was also something in his expression that suggested the effort was worth it. This was not simply physical pain management. This was the construction of meaning through action. "You are extraordinarily careful with your movements," she observed. "Dr. Ashford would not approve of this level of strain." "Dr. Ashford is not about to become a father," Sebastian replied, without looking up from his work. "My physician can manage the medical aspects of this pregnancy. I am managing the aspects that are beyond medicine." The pregnancy progressed with the kind of ordinary difficulty that Dr. Ashford had suggested was normal and manageable. Catherine experienced the typical discomforts: nausea that faded by the 4th month, fatigue that occasionally rendered her unable to do more than sit in the morning room and read, the physical awkwardness of a body that was transforming itself to accommodate new life. The most significant challenge came in the 6th month, when Catherine developed what Dr. Ashford identified as a circulatory complication. Nothing dangerous, he assured them, but requiring careful management and considerable rest. "You are to remain in the house," the Duke instructed, with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "No walks, no unnecessary exertion, nothing that might exacerbate the condition." "I am pregnant, not dying," Catherine replied with exasperation. "I am capable of light activity. I am capable of managing myself." "And yet you will not do so," Sebastian said firmly. "You will rest. You will allow the household to function around you, and you will permit me to worry about you without constant argument." It was, she understood, his way of expressing love, through control, through the management of variables, through the application of will to protect what he valued. She had learned to recognize this impulse beneath its surface manifestations, and so she submitted to his insistence, with better grace than she might have otherwise. The period of restricted activity brought with it unexpected benefits. With Catherine largely confined to the house, the Duke remained close rather than managing the estates with his usual deliberation. They developed a rhythm that was different from their typical pattern, long hours spent together in the morning room, where Catherine could rest while remaining in his company. It was during one of these afternoons that Catherine asked him something she had been contemplating for weeks. "If the child is a son," she said carefully, "what will you teach him? What legacy do you intend to create beyond the simple fact of his inheritance?" Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on her belly, where the child was making its presence known through movements that still seemed miraculous despite their increasing frequency. "I will teach him," he said finally, "that strength is not the absence of pain or difficulty. I will teach him that a man's value is not determined by his physical capacity or his lack of limitation. I will teach him that resilience is built through adversity, not despite it. And I will teach him that the women in his life, his mother particularly, are to be respected for their own strength, not merely protected for their fragility." "And if the child is a daughter?" Catherine asked. "Then I will teach her all of the same things," Sebastian said without hesitation. "But I will teach her additionally that the world will attempt to convince her that her value depends on her ability to be protected and managed. I will teach her that she is capable of protecting herself, of managing herself, of building her own path. I will teach her that she should never accept a marriage merely for security, but that if she chooses such a marriage, it should be one based on genuine partnership." Catherine felt tears rise to her eyes. Tears of pregnancy hormones, yes, but also of something more profound. This man who had been so isolated, so closed off, was now thinking about the future he would build with the child they were creating. He was imagining a legacy that extended beyond the mere continuation of his title. "You will be an extraordinary father," she said quietly. "I will be a father who is sometimes in pain," Sebastian corrected. "A father who cannot always physically play with his children as other fathers do. A father whose limitations will be visible and undeniable. But I will attempt to be one who loves them with the full force of his being, who values them for their own worth rather than their utility, and who teaches them that damage and limitation are part of the human experience, not aberrations from it." By the 7th month, Catherine's condition had improved sufficiently that Dr. Ashford permitted her to resume light activity. She began to spend more time in the nursery that had been prepared, overseeing the final arrangements. And it was there, one afternoon when Sebastian found her arranging blankets in the cradle he had built, that she felt the first sharp pain that suggested something might be wrong. It was not severe, merely a tightening, a sensation of pressure, but it was enough to make her grip the edge of the cradle for support. "Catherine," Sebastian's voice came from the doorway, and she understood that he had been watching her, monitoring her, ready to respond to any sign of difficulty. "It is nothing," she said immediately, "merely a tightening." Dr. Ashford mentioned that such things were normal as the body prepared for birth, but she could see the concern in his eyes, could see him performing the calculation of how much alarm was appropriate, how much protective action was warranted, and she understood that for the next 2 months he would exist in a state of careful vigilance, ready always to intervene, to protect, to ensure that both Catherine and the child were safe. That evening he brought her a journal. "I have been thinking," he said, placing it on the table beside her chair, "that our child should know the story of how they came to exist. Not the social version, but the real version, the messy, complicated, extraordinary version that involved a proposal that was not romantic, a marriage that began as convenience, and a transformation that neither of us anticipated. I thought that perhaps you might write it down, for our child to read when they are old enough to understand." Catherine picked up the journal, understanding the significance of what he was offering. He was asking her to create a record of their story, not the polished version that society would tell, but the authentic version that contained all the complexity and transformation and genuine love. "I will," she said simply, and she began that very night, writing the story of their marriage in words that were meant for their child, for future generations, for the world to understand that love is not always immediate, that marriage is not always convenient, that sometimes the greatest transformations come through the meeting of two people who are willing to be truly known. The 8th month brought a peculiar combination of anticipation and anxiety that seemed to settle over Ravensbrook House like a fog that would not lift. Catherine was now unmistakably pregnant, her body a clear manifestation of the child that had been growing within her for months. She moved more slowly, rested more frequently, and had begun to exist in a state of semi-permanent discomfort that Dr. Ashford assured her was entirely normal and would resolve itself shortly after the birth. The Duke, meanwhile, had entered into what Catherine privately termed controlled urgency. He had brought a nurse from London to remain in the house, a woman of considerable experience with difficult deliveries and the complications that sometimes accompanied them. He had ensured that Dr. Ashford was on call at all times, with alternative physicians identified in case of emergency. He had read every text he could find regarding childbirth, maternal complications, and neonatal care. And he had begun to exhibit signs of anxiety that he attempted, without entire success, to conceal from Catherine. "You are terrified," Catherine said one afternoon, finding him in his study with yet another medical text open before him. "I am concerned," Sebastian corrected, though the distinction seemed thin. "The process of childbirth carries inherent risks. Women die in childbirth. Children die during the birth process. These are not abstract possibilities. They are actual events that occur with regularity." "Yes," Catherine said, settling herself in a chair across from his desk, with the careful movements that pregnancy now required. "And I will manage them as I have managed every other difficulty in my life, with courage, with adaptation, and with the support of people who love me." "You are very brave," Sebastian said, "and very stubborn. An unfortunate combination at the moment, as it makes it impossible for me to convince you to do anything other than face this impending catastrophe with your usual equanimity." "It is not a catastrophe," Catherine said firmly. "It is a biological process that millions of women have completed successfully. Yes, there are complications that occur. Yes, there are risks. But there are also countless women who have passed through childbirth and emerged stronger, more complete, more fully themselves. I intend to be one of them." She rose, an action that now required considerable effort, and moved around the desk. "You are permitted to be concerned," she continued, taking his face in her hands. "You are permitted to worry. But you are not permitted to allow that concern and worry to prevent me from moving forward with courage. Do you understand? Your love does not require my fear. It requires only my commitment, and that you already have." The final weeks of pregnancy brought Catherine's circulatory complication back with increased severity. Dr. Ashford expressed no alarm, but Catherine could see the increased frequency of his consultations, the additional instructions he gave regarding activity levels and rest. She could see the Duke's quiet fury at his own helplessness, that for all his will and determination, he could not simply will away the difficulties her body was experiencing. It was in this context that a letter arrived from Catherine's mother. Her mother had remained in contact throughout the pregnancy, but communication had been limited to correspondence, as travel had seemed inadvisable. Now, however, her letter expressed her intention to come to Ravensbrook House for the birth itself. She wished to be present for her daughter. She wished to provide support during the labor. She wished, Catherine understood, reading between the lines, to ensure that her daughter would have a woman's presence in addition to the physicians and the Duke. "You should invite her to come immediately," the Duke said when Catherine showed him the letter. "Not in a week, not when you believe the birth is imminent, but now. I want you surrounded by people who love you. I want witnesses to what you accomplish. I want the world to understand that you are not merely a woman being delivered of a child. You are a woman creating life, enduring pain, transforming yourself in the process of becoming a mother." Catherine's mother arrived 3 days later, and her presence seemed to transform the household in unexpected ways. She brought with her a kind of practical acceptance of the birth process that neither the Duke nor the medical professionals could quite embody. She had birthed Catherine herself and had survived the process. She moved through the house with a calm confidence that seemed to settle the underlying anxiety that had been building. "Men worry," she said to Catherine one afternoon, speaking quietly while the Duke was occupied with estate business. "But women who have given birth understand that the process, while difficult, is not the catastrophe that men fear it to be. Your body knows what to do. Your mind is strong enough to endure what is required. You will emerge from this changed, yes, but not broken." The 9th month arrived with increasing discomfort and growing anticipation. Catherine's circulation remained problematic, but Dr. Ashford seemed increasingly confident that the pregnancy would reach proper term, that the child was developing normally, that the risks associated with premature birth could be managed. It was during this final month that Catherine completed the journal she had been writing for their child. She had written the entire story. her poverty and desperation, the Duke's mysterious proposal, the initial distance between them, the gradual transformation of their relationship, the love that had developed through crisis and vulnerability rather than sentiment. She had written it in language that was both honest and beautiful, that acknowledged difficulty without surrendering to despair, that celebrated the extraordinary nature of an ordinary marriage. On a night when the moon was full and bright, she brought the completed journal to Sebastian. "Our child's story," she said, placing it in his hands. "The real one. Not the story that society will tell about the Duke who married beneath his station, but the story of two people who came together in difficulty and created something unexpected and genuine." He opened the journal and began to read, and Catherine watched as his expression transformed, saw the recognition of their story as she had told it, the acknowledgement of his own transformation as she had witnessed it, the understanding that what they had created together was not merely a marriage, but a legacy. "You are extraordinary," he said, not looking up from the pages. "You have taken our messy, complicated, difficult marriage and transformed it into something that is both honest and beautiful. Our child will read this and understand that love is not about perfection. It is about choice, repeated daily, despite difficulty." 2 days later, Catherine woke in the early morning with a sensation of pressure and tightening that was different from the Braxton Hicks contractions she had been experiencing for weeks. This was something deeper, more insistent, more clearly directed toward a specific outcome. "Sebastian," she said quietly, reaching for him in the darkness, "I believe the time has come." He was awake instantly, alert despite the sleep that had occupied him moments before. He reached for the bell pull and rang it with quiet urgency, and as the household began to stir, servants moving quickly to prepare the birthing chamber, Dr. Ashford arriving with his instruments, Catherine's mother moving to her daughter's side, Sebastian remained at the center of all this activity, his hand holding Catherine's, his presence offering the only comfort that mattered. "You are so brave," he said, as the contractions began in earnest. "You are about to accomplish the most difficult thing you have ever done, and you are doing it with courage. I am witnessing the moment when you become not just my wife, not just a duchess, but a mother. And it is the most profound transformation I have ever seen." Catherine squeezed his hand, unable to speak as her body began its long work of bringing their child into the world. The labor began at dawn and progressed through the day with the kind of methodical intensity that characterized everything Catherine did. She moved through the pain with a combination of acceptance and determination, neither surrendering to it nor attempting to resist it, but rather integrating it into the experience of her body's extraordinary work. The Duke remained at her side throughout. Though he was not permitted in the birthing chamber itself, propriety still maintained certain boundaries, even at moments of such profound intimacy. But he was there immediately outside, where Catherine could hear his voice calling encouragement through the door when the pain became most intense, where he waited through the long afternoon with the same kind of focused presence that characterized his every important action. By late afternoon, Dr. Ashford was expressing cautious optimism. The labor was progressing normally. The child was in the correct position. There was no indication of the complications that sometimes accompanied childbirth. Catherine's body was doing precisely what it had been created to do. "You are nearly there," Catherine's mother said, bathing her forehead with cool water. "I can see the child's head. A few more pushes and your daughter will be born." "Daughter?" Catherine gasped, the word arriving between contractions. "Daughter," her mother confirmed with absolute certainty. "I know these things. I felt the same with you. And I can tell you that you are about to give birth to a girl who will be every bit as strong and determined as her mother." When the final contraction came, the one that seemed to contain all of her fear and her courage and her determination in a single moment of absolute culmination, Catherine pushed with everything she was, and then suddenly the pressure released, and a sound unlike anything she had ever heard in her life filled the birthing chamber. A cry, a human sound, the voice of her daughter announcing her presence to the world. She could see Dr. Ashford working quickly, assessing, ensuring that everything was as it should be. She could see her mother's face, radiant with joy and triumph. And then, in her arms, wrapped in clean cloth that was still warm from the fire, was the child she had carried for 9 months. A small girl with a shock of dark hair, Sebastian's dark hair, and eyes that were still unfocused but present, aware, alive. "She is perfect," Catherine whispered, and it seemed insufficient to contain what she was feeling. "She is," Dr. Ashford confirmed, "a healthy girl, 10 pounds, Excellent lungs, as we have established. The Duchess has accomplished exactly what her body was designed to accomplish, and done so with remarkable efficiency. Catherine held her daughter close, understanding that something essential had shifted in her understanding of herself. She was no longer simply Catherine, no longer simply the Duchess. She was a mother. She had created this child, had carried her, had endured the pain of bringing her into existence, and the weight of that accomplishment, the profundity of that transformation, seemed almost too great to contain within her ordinary body. "I wish to see my husband," she said, and within moments the door opened and Sebastian stood in the threshold. Catherine would remember the expression on his face forever, the way he looked at his daughter, at the child that he and Catherine had created together, at the visible manifestation of the future they had promised each other. He moved to the bed with careful deliberation and knelt beside them, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the small face of his child. "She has your strength," he said quietly. "I can see it already. She will not be a woman who merely survives. She will be a woman who transforms the world around her." "She is only minutes old," Catherine said, laughing at the absurdity and the truth of his assessment simultaneously. "You cannot possibly determine her nature from her appearance." "Cannot I?" Sebastian asked. He was still looking at his daughter with absolute focus. Her mother has demonstrated that change and growth are possible, even in the most constrained circumstances. Her father has demonstrated that resilience and courage are not the products of ease, but of difficulty transcended. Do you truly believe she will be anything less than extraordinary? The midwife and Dr. Ashford worked efficiently to complete the business of birth, the delivery of the afterbirth, the inspection of Catherine's body to ensure that no damage had been done, the assessment that she had endured the process remarkably well and would likely recover fully within a reasonable period. "The Duchess should rest now," Dr. Ashford instructed, addressing Sebastian rather than Catherine, a convention of the time that Catherine would ordinarily have bristled at, but at this moment seemed insignificant. "Mother and child should sleep. The father may visit briefly, but both require rest after such exertion." Sebastian bent and kissed Catherine's forehead, then placed his lips gently against his daughter's forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, and Catherine understood that the gratitude was for all of it, for the transformation, for the courage, for the gift of a child that had no medical reason to exist, given his condition and years of isolation. That night, as Catherine lay in the recovery bed with her daughter sleeping beside her, she found that sleep was impossible despite her exhaustion. She was too aware of the transformation that had occurred, too full of the reality of what she had accomplished, too utterly present in the moment, to allow unconsciousness to claim her. The midwife had told her the baby's name requirement, that they must choose a name soon, that the child must be registered, that this formal declaration of identity would occur within days. Catherine had not consulted with Sebastian, but she knew already what she wanted to name their daughter. When Sebastian returned in the early morning, exhausted from his long vigil, and yet somehow energized by the reality of fatherhood, Catherine told him, "Eleanor," she said simply. "I wish to name her Eleanor, after my grandmother, who survived great difficulty and raised my mother with courage. But also," Catherine continued, "I wish to name her for the fact that she is newly born into a world that will test her, challenge her, demand that she be strong. Eleanor means bright one. I want our daughter to know from the moment her name is spoken that she is expected to shine." "Eleanor," Sebastian repeated, tasting the name as though it was something precious. "Eleanor Alden, the future Duchess of Ravensbrück, a woman who will know from birth that she is valued for her own worth, not for her utility or her connection to a man. Yes, Eleanor is perfect." Over the following days, as Catherine recovered from the labor and Eleanor grew stronger with each feeding, the household seemed to shift into a new configuration. The Duke, who had been managing his condition and his position and his marriage with careful discipline, now allowed himself to become something new, a father. He could be seen in the morning sitting with Eleanor, marveling at her existence, speaking to her in quiet tones about the world she would inherit, the woman she would become. The household staff, initially uncertain how to address the arrival of an heir, even a female heir, quickly adapted to the reality of a duke who was utterly devoted to his daughter, who insisted on being present for feedings, who had Eleanor's cradle placed not in a distant nursery, but in the Duchess's chambers, so that both parents could participate in the care of their child. And Catherine, despite the physical difficulties of recovery, the pain, the exhaustion, the overwhelming nature of caring for a newborn, found that she had been transformed in ways she could not have anticipated. She was no longer simply a woman who had survived. She was a woman who had created. She was a mother, which was a designation that seemed to encompass her entire existence in new and profound ways. 3 weeks after Eleanor's birth, Catherine stood in the garden for the first time since going into labor, her body still recovering from the extraordinary exertion of childbirth, but capable of supporting her weight and her movement. The spring sun was warm on her face, and in her arms, wrapped carefully in blankets to protect her from the lingering chill of early April, was Eleanor. The Duke was beside them, his hand at Catherine's elbow, not out of propriety, but out of protective instinct. Though Catherine was recovering well, he remained attuned to her physical limitations in a way that suggested genuine concern rather than the condescension that sometimes accompanied such attention. "She is taking in the world," Sebastian observed, watching as Eleanor's unfocused eyes moved across the garden, absorbing sensations and shapes and the infinite complexity of existence. "One day she will understand that this garden is where her parents acknowledged their love for each other, where her father learned that vulnerability is not a weakness, where her mother demonstrated that courage can be sustained across months and years, not merely in singular moments." "She will understand nothing of the sort," Catherine said, though she was smiling. "She will be far too busy building her own extraordinary life to care about the peculiarities of her parents' marriage." "Perhaps," Sebastian conceded, "but I intend to tell her. I intend to tell her that her mother was a woman of no particular fortune who married a man of considerable title purely because she was willing to see past his carefully constructed walls. I intend to tell her that her father was a man broken by circumstance who was remade through the presence of a woman who refused to accept his narrative of inevitable decline. I intend for her to understand that the greatest transformation in her life will not be something that happens to her, but something that happens with another person, someone she chooses, someone who chooses her, someone with whom she can be truly known." "You intend to tell her all of this while she is an infant incapable of comprehending language," Catherine observed with amusement. "I intend to tell her all of this repeatedly, from her earliest moments until she is old enough to understand," Sebastian corrected. "I want it to become part of the narrative of her existence, so that when she comes to understand love, when she comes to understand marriage, when she comes to understand the choice to commit to another person, she will do so with the fullest understanding of what is possible and what is required." They walked through the garden in companionable silence, and Catherine found herself thinking about the transformation that had occurred over the months since her marriage. She had arrived at Ravensbrook House as a woman desperate for security, willing to marry a stranger to escape poverty. She had become, through crisis and vulnerability and the radical choice to remain, a woman who had transformed not just her own life, but the life of the man she married. And now, carrying their daughter, she was becoming something else entirely. A mother, which seemed to be the most complex and profound identity she had yet inhabited. "I received a letter from Aunt Constance," Catherine said, the thought arriving from nowhere. "She wishes to visit, to see Eleanor." She felt Sebastian tense beside her. Constance had been one of the earliest sources of difficulty in their marriage, a woman whose approval was never to be obtained, whose judgment was always disapproving. That she now wished to see Eleanor suggested either a remarkable change of heart or an attempt at manipulation. "Will you permit her to come?" Sebastian asked carefully. "I will," Catherine said, "but on my terms. She will treat me with respect. She will treat you with respect. And she will understand that Eleanor is mine. My child, my daughter, my heir in the sense that she is the future I have chosen and am actively constructing. She will not control Eleanor. She will not attempt to shape her. She will observe that a woman can be happy in a marriage that does not look like society's expectations and will adapt her judgments accordingly, or she will not visit again." "You have become formidable," Sebastian said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. "When I selected you, I recognized intelligence and courage. I did not anticipate that I was selecting a woman who would become a force of nature." "People are not selected so much as they are revealed," Catherine said. "You did not make me formidable. You simply loved me in a way that allowed me to discover formidability in myself." Constance's visit came 3 weeks later, and it transpired largely as Catherine had predicted. Her aunt arrived with criticisms on her lips and left with Eleanor's hand wrapped around her finger, utterly transformed by the presence of a child who had been created in a marriage that Constance had believed would be a disaster. "She has your strength," Constance said when she finally held Eleanor, and Catherine understood that this was as close to an apology as her aunt would ever come, an acknowledgement that she had misjudged, that the marriage had not been a tragedy, that something unexpected and genuine had been created. By the time Eleanor was 3 months old, Catherine had recovered fully from the labor. Her body had transformed back to something approaching its pre-pregnancy state, though different in ways that were subtle but significant. She carried herself differently, moved with a new authority that came from having done something that required the entire force of her being. She had brought life into the world. That accomplishment could not be undone or diminished by any social convention. It was during this period of recovery and transformation that Dr. Ashford visited one final time for what he deemed a comprehensive assessment of both Catherine's recovery and the Duke's condition. What he reported was extraordinary. The Duke's pain levels had decreased further. His mobility had increased. His capacity for physical activity without triggering crisis had expanded significantly. And while Dr. Ashford was careful to suggest that this might be temporary, that pain was fundamentally unpredictable, there was also a clear sense that something had shifted fundamentally in the Duke's condition. "I believe," Dr. Ashford said carefully, "that the improvements we are observing are related to the reduction in his anxiety and isolation. Chronic pain frequently worsens with emotional distress and isolation. Conversely, love, purpose, and genuine partnership seem to have a measurable effect on pain perception and physical function. Your marriage, Your Grace, appears to have therapeutic properties that no medication I could prescribe would equal." After the physician had departed, the Duke sat with Eleanor in his lap and he wept, not the tears of pain or despair that he had shed in his isolation, but tears of gratitude and wonder. "I was a man who believed that my value had been destroyed," he said, addressing his tears to his daughter, who was observing him with the focused curiosity of an infant. "I believed that because my body was damaged, I was damaged, that because I experienced pain I was fundamentally broken. And then your mother came and she refused to accept that narrative. She insisted that I could be loved, that I could be transformed, that I could have a future. And she was correct. You are proof of that. Your existence is proof that a broken man can become whole, not by ceasing to be broken, but by accepting the breaking as part of the pattern of his existence." Catherine watched her husband hold their daughter, and she understood that the marriage they had created was not merely functional or even satisfactory. It was genuinely extraordinary. It was a marriage that had begun as convenience and had been transformed through choice, through vulnerability, through the radical act of being truly known, into something that transcended ordinary categories. Society, which had initially questioned the marriage, had now begun to celebrate it. The Duke's devotion to his Duchess had become legendary. The Duchess's dignity and strength had become exemplary. And Eleanor, the child of their union, had become a symbol of what was possible when two people were willing to transcend the boundaries that society attempted to impose. 6 months after Eleanor's birth, Catherine stood in the conservatory of Ravensbrook House, the space that had, over the months of their marriage, become sacred to both her and the Duke. The autumn light was golden, casting everything in a warm glow that seemed to transform even the ordinary objects of the room into something precious. Eleanor was with her, now old enough to sit on her own, old enough to recognize faces, old enough to smile with genuine recognition when her father entered a room. She was a solemn child, Catherine had begun to notice, not overly given to constant laughter, but capable of deep focus and sustained observation. She would be, Catherine suspected, a woman very much like her mother. "I received a letter from Dr. Ashford," Sebastian said, entering the conservatory as though summoned by Catherine's thoughts of him. "He is publishing a paper on the relationship between emotional well-being and chronic pain management. He has requested permission to reference my case as an example of how comprehensive emotional support can affect pain perception and physical function." "And what did you tell him?" Catherine asked, watching as Sebastian settled himself beside Eleanor and began to speak to her in the quiet tones that she had come to recognize as his most intimate mode of communication. "I told him that he was welcome to reference my case, with the specification that he also acknowledge your role in the transformation. I will not have my recovery credited merely to medical intervention and will. I will not have the substantial contributions of my wife minimized in service to a narrative that suggests I accomplished this alone." He looked at Catherine, and she saw in his expression the complete reversal of the man who had selected her in desperation and hope. He was no longer a man in thrall to isolation. He was no longer a man convinced that his damage rendered him unworthy of love or partnership. He was a man utterly confident in his own value, not despite his limitations, but integrated alongside them. "You have made me extraordinarily happy," he said quietly, "in ways that I did not believe possible, in ways that I did not believe happiness could exist. And you have done this not by fixing me, not by curing me, not by making the pain go away. You have done this by simply refusing to accept that the pain defined my existence, by insisting that I am a man worthy of love and partnership, and a future that contains joy alongside difficulty, by creating, with me, a child who will grow up understanding that transformation is possible even when cure is not." Catherine took his hand and placed it over Eleanor's small one. The gesture seemed to contain everything that they had created together: the vulnerability that had allowed intimacy, the courage that had sustained them through crisis, the love that had been built not instantaneously, but through choice, repeatedly, across months and years. "You were not wrong when you selected me," Catherine said quietly, "but perhaps not for the reasons you believed at the time. You selected me not because I was someone without family connections or particular fortune. You selected me because you were ready, however unconsciously, to be loved, because somewhere beneath the walls you had constructed, there was a part of you that wanted to be known. I simply had the courage to insist on that knowing, and the stubbornness to persist when you attempted to maintain your distance." Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened toward winter, the household of Ravensbrook House continued its transformation. The Duke, who had been a largely absent public figure for 7 years, began to appear with increasing frequency in London society, not frequently enough to constitute a dramatic presence, but enough to demonstrate that he was engaged with the world, that his condition was not catastrophic, that he had constructed a life that was functional and purposeful. Catherine, who had arrived as a woman desperate for security, had become one of the most respected women in London society. Her dignity, her intelligence, her obvious devotion to her husband and her role, and most significantly, her refusal to accept the pity or condescension that sometimes accompanied discussions of the Duke's condition, had transformed her into an exemplary duchess. Constance had ceased her criticisms entirely. She had become, in fact, one of Eleanor's most devoted visitors, transformed by the presence of a child who represented the triumph of genuine partnership over social convention. Catherine's mother spent increasing amounts of time at Ravensbrook House, having been offered a small cottage on the estate, where she could live in comfort and participate in Eleanor's upbringing without the burden of the anxiety that had previously consumed her. Lord Edward had not entirely ceased his machinations, but they had become so transparent, so obviously motivated by resentment, that they were no longer effective. He attempted occasionally to plant seeds of doubt, to suggest that the Duke's devotion was merely the product of his pain, to intimate that Catherine was taking advantage of his condition. But each such attempt was met with the united front of a husband and wife who had moved beyond the necessity of defending their marriage to anyone other than themselves. On a winter evening, as snow began to fall outside the windows of the drawing-room, Catherine found the Duke in his study reading Eleanor a story. The child was nearly asleep, her eyes drooping closed, even as she struggled against the pull of rest. "She is fighting sleep," Catherine observed, settling herself in a chair nearby. "She fights against everything that suggests a boundary," Sebastian said, continuing to read in his low, measured voice. "She fights against sleep, against the need for food, against the limitation of her small body. I wonder what kind of woman she will become. I suspect she will be extraordinary. I suspect she will be human," Catherine corrected gently, "which means she will contain multitudes. She will be extraordinary in some ways and ordinary in others. She will triumph in some circumstances and fail in others. She will be loved and will be hurt. She will be capable of great strength and will also experience great vulnerability. She will be, in other words, completely and utterly herself, which is the only extraordinary thing any of us can be." "When did you become such a philosopher?" Sebastian asked, though he was smiling. "When I stopped expecting life to be other than what it is," Catherine replied. "When I accepted that survival and joy could coexist. When I married a man I did not know, and discovered that I could come to love him completely. When I gave birth to a child, and understood that I was capable of creating something beyond myself. These are not philosophical revelations, Sebastian. They are simple truths that I have learned through living." Eleanor finally surrendered to sleep, and the Duke carefully lifted her and carried her to the nursery, where the night nurse would watch over her. When he returned, Catherine was still sitting in the study, looking at a book that she had been reading, the journal she had written during her pregnancy, the story of their marriage intended for Eleanor. "Are you adding to it?" he asked, seeing the pen in her hand. "I am," Catherine said. "I am writing about this moment, about the woman I have become through marriage to you, about the child we have created, about the understanding that life is not about happiness as a constant state, but about the capacity to find meaning, even in difficulty, about the fact that I married you in desperation and discovered love. That seems like the kind of truth Eleanor should know." "When will you share it with her?" he asked. "When she is old enough to understand that not all love stories begin with passion," Catherine said. "When she is capable of recognizing that transformation is possible, even when it is not anticipated. When she is ready to understand that her parents' marriage is not a fairy tale, but something perhaps more valuable, a lived example of two people choosing, daily, to remain committed to truth over comfort, to vulnerability over protection, to partnership over isolation." The Duke moved to Catherine and drew her close, and they stood together in the study as snow fell outside, as Eleanor slept in her nursery, as the fire crackled in the fireplace, and the ordinary moments of their extraordinary marriage continued to unfold. "I love you," he said simply. "And I love you," Catherine replied, "in all the ways that love can exist, as commitment, as choice, as the daily decision to remain when departure would be easier, as the willingness to know another person completely and to be known in return, as the ability to see someone's damage and to love them, not despite it, but alongside it. This is what I have learned from you, and from this marriage. This is what I intend to teach our daughter." They remained there holding each other, two people who had begun as near strangers and had become each other's entire world, each other's greatest challenge and greatest gift, each other's evidence that transformation is possible even when the circumstances seem to suggest it is not. And in the morning, Eleanor would wake and require tending, and the Duke would adjust his pain management medications, and Catherine would review household accounts, and the ordinary machinery of their extraordinary marriage would continue to function. But in this moment, they existed in stillness, in presence, in the profound recognition of what they had created together, not merely a marriage, but a life worth living. 5 years later, the garden at Ravensbrook House had transformed considerably in the 5 years since Eleanor's birth. What had once been a space reserved for the private moments of a duke and duchess had become a place of movement and activity, a space where a 5-year-old girl with dark hair and determined eyes could run without the endless restraint that society ordinarily demanded of young ladies. Eleanor Alden was, at this moment, demonstrating a particular skill that had become notorious within the household, the ability to ask questions that seemed designed to expose the inadequacy of answers. She was seated between her parents on a stone bench, her small hand in her father's larger one, her dark eyes fixed on her mother with absolute focus. "But if Papa was in pain," Eleanor asked, having clearly been contemplating this question for some time, "how did he manage to hold me when I was born? Wouldn't the pain have prevented it?" Catherine exchanged a glance with Sebastian, and she saw in his expression the particular combination of amusement and profound love that their daughter seemed to inspire in him consistently. This child had inherited his intelligence and her mother's fearlessness, a combination that seemed designed to question everything and accept nothing on face value. "Your father," Catherine said carefully, "has learned to do many things despite his pain, because your father understands something that many people do not. That pain is not the same as inability. Pain is a feeling. It is unpleasant. It is sometimes overwhelming, but it does not prevent action. It does not prevent love. It does not prevent creating meaning. It simply requires that your father be very deliberate about what he chooses to do, and very committed to doing those things despite the discomfort." "Like how I learned to ride a horse even though I was frightened?" Eleanor asked, her logic cutting directly to the heart of the matter with the kind of clarity that only children seem to possess. "Exactly like that," Sebastian said, squeezing his daughter's hand. "Fear and pain are both things that demand we decide whether we will permit them to prevent us from living, or whether we will live despite them. Your mother taught me this lesson 5 years ago. I am teaching it to you now. Perhaps one day you will teach it to someone else." Eleanor considered this with the serious expression that seemed to be her default mode. She was not a child given to constant play or idle laughter, though she was capable of both. Instead, she seemed to be always in the process of observing, learning, integrating information, about how the world actually functioned beneath the surface of what society presented. "I wish to speak with Dr. Ashford," Eleanor announced suddenly. "He has written a paper and I wish to understand his theories. Papa says I have a logical mind. I believe I should apply it to understanding the relationship between emotional well-being and physical sensation." Catherine found herself looking at her 5-year-old daughter with a mixture of exasperation and pride. The child had managed in one sentence to reference a physician's academic work, to declare an intention to engage with it, and to use her understanding of her own cognitive abilities to justify this intention. "You are 5 years old," Catherine said carefully. "Dr. Ashford's paper is written in language that requires considerable education to understand." "Then I shall require considerable education," Eleanor replied simply. "Papa's library contains numerous texts. I have been observing them. I believe I am ready to begin systematic study." "Of course she is," Sebastian said, though there was laughter in his voice. "She is the daughter of a woman who learned to be a duchess, despite no preparation whatsoever, and a man who learned to live with chronic pain, despite every circumstance suggesting he should surrender to despair. She is not simply ready for systematic study, she is prepared for it by inheritance." Over the following weeks, Eleanor did indeed begin her systematic education. Catherine and Sebastian established a small schoolroom in the library, a space that had once been Sebastian's refuge during his isolation, but had now been transformed into something more functional. A tutor was engaged, a woman of considerable learning who specialized in educating young people of exceptional ability. And Eleanor, with the focused determination that seemed to characterize her entire existence, began to consume information, with the hunger of someone who understood that knowledge was power. It was during this period that Catherine realized something significant had shifted, not just in Eleanor's development, but in the entire structure of their family. The marriage that had begun as a transaction had become a partnership. The partnership had become love. And now, love had become legacy. Eleanor watched her parents with the attention of a scientist observing a complex phenomenon. She observed that her father managed pain, not through isolation, but through engagement. She observed that her mother had transformed herself from desperation into confidence through the act of choosing to remain present. She observed that partnership, genuine partnership, was not about perfection, but about commitment repeated daily. One afternoon, finding her father resting after a particularly difficult morning, one of the days when the pain seemed to reassert its dominance despite months of improvement, Eleanor moved to sit beside him. "Does it hurt very much?" she asked, with the directness that characterized her. "Yes," Sebastian said, not attempting to minimize his experience for his daughter. "Today it hurts quite a bit. Yesterday it hurt less. Tomorrow it may hurt more or less. I cannot predict it. But the pain is not the most important thing about my life. Your mother is the most important thing. You are the most important thing. The estates are important. My responsibilities are important. The pain is simply something that exists alongside these important things." "And when the pain is overwhelming?" Eleanor asked. "When it prevents you from doing what you wish to do?" "Then I adapt," Sebastian said. "I find different ways to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. I receive help from people who love me. I rest. I manage myself carefully, and I remind myself that pain is temporary, not in the sense that it will disappear, but in the sense that it comes and goes, and the moments when it is less overwhelming will return." Eleanor absorbed this with her characteristic focus. She seemed to be integrating information not merely intellectually, but emotionally, building an understanding of resilience not as the absence of difficulty, but as the capacity to continue despite it. By Eleanor's 6th birthday, the household of Ravensbrook House had developed a particular rhythm that seemed to accommodate all of its various members and requirements. The Duke managed his condition with the kind of methodical precision that had become his signature. The Duchess managed the estates with the quiet authority of someone who had earned her position through demonstrated capability. Eleanor managed her own education with the focused intensity that seemed to define her. But perhaps more significantly, they managed their family with the understanding that had been hard-won through years of crisis and transformation. They understood that love was not about perfection. They understood that partnership required vulnerability. They understood that the greatest transformations often came through the least anticipated circumstances. It was on Eleanor's 6th birthday, as the child sat examining a gift that her parents had given her, a medical text that had been specially illustrated and annotated for her age level, that Catherine felt Sebastian's hand slip into hers. "We have created something extraordinary," he said quietly, watching their daughter read with absolute concentration. "We have created several things," Catherine replied. "A marriage, a child, a household, a future that neither of us could have anticipated when we first met." "No," Sebastian said, "I mean something more than that. We have created a model, an example, evidence that transformation is possible even when circumstances seem to suggest it is not. Our daughter will grow up understanding that pain does not define value, that damage does not negate worth, that the greatest strength often comes through the integration of vulnerability rather than its denial. She will teach this to others. She will create her own transformations, and the legacy will continue." Catherine watched Eleanor, so small and so focused, absorbing information about the world, with the hunger of someone who understood that knowledge was essential to understanding life itself. She thought about the woman she had been when she arrived at Ravensbrook House, desperate, dependent, convinced that survival was the best she could hope for. She thought about the transformation that had occurred through the simple act of remaining, through the choice to love despite difficulty, through the willingness to be known. "Our daughter will be extraordinary," Catherine agreed, "but not because of anything we have done for her, because of what we have done together, in her presence. She will understand from her earliest moments that love is not about protecting someone from difficulty, it is about accompanying them through it. She will understand that partnership is possible even, especially, when both people have been damaged by life. She will understand that transformation is not about becoming someone different, but about becoming more fully yourself." In the years that followed, as Eleanor grew older and her intelligence became more evident, the household of Ravensbrook House became quietly legendary, not for drama or scandal, but for something far more profound, for the demonstration that a marriage could be built on genuine partnership, that a man could live with chronic pain and still create meaning, that a woman could transform herself from desperation into power, and that a child could inherit the understanding that these things were possible. The Duke's health stabilized in a way that Dr. Ashford had come to recognize as optimal under the circumstances. The pain remained, but it no longer dominated his existence. He was capable of managing the estates with Catherine's support. He was capable of being an engaged father. He was capable of building a life that was not about the absence of pain, but about the presence of meaning alongside the pain. The Duchess became one of the most respected women in London society, not because of her title or her beauty, but because of her demonstrated integrity, her intelligence, and her absolute refusal to pretend to be anything other than what she was, a woman who had married below her circumstances, a woman who had transformed herself through choice and commitment, a woman who understood that the greatest power came not from pretense, but from authenticity. And Eleanor grew into a girl who asked uncomfortable questions, who understood complex concepts, who demonstrated through her very existence that the values her parents had modeled, vulnerability, adaptation, genuine partnership, were not weaknesses to be overcome but strengths to be developed and expanded. The marriage that had begun as a transaction, that had been nearly destroyed by crisis, that had been threatened by external opposition, had not merely survived, it had flourished. And in its flourishing, it had created a legacy that extended far beyond the two people who had created it, into the world, into the future, into the understanding of what was possible when two people chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to remain committed to truth over comfort, to love over isolation, to partnership over the illusion of independence. This was not a fairy tale. It was something far more valuable. It was a lived example of transformation, of resilience, of what could be created when two damaged people refused to accept society's narrative of their own limitations. And in the garden at Ravensbrook House, where a duchess and duke sat with their daughter, where pain and love coexisted without negating each other, where the future was being built not through the denial of difficulty, but through the integration of it, the legacy continued to unfold, day after day, choice after choice, moment after moment of commitment to what was real, what was true, and what was genuinely possible. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the halls of Ravensbrook House, where two souls transformed each other through the courage to be truly known. On behalf of Victorian Romance Audio Stories, we are profoundly grateful for the time you have invested in Eleanor, Catherine, and Sebastian's story, a tale of how love transcends circumstance, how partnership heals isolation, and how the greatest strength often comes through the integration of our deepest vulnerabilities. If this story moved you, If you found yourself believing in the possibility of transformation, if you felt the weight and beauty of a marriage built on genuine commitment rather than convenience, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these timeless stories of love, resilience, and authentic connection to life. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which moment in Catherine and Sebastian's journey most deeply affected you? Do you believe in the power of genuine partnership to transform lives? What legacy would you wish to create through your own commitments and choices? Share this video with someone who needs to believe in the power of love to overcome circumstance. Share it with someone who has ever felt broken and wondered if transformation was possible. Share it with someone who understands that the greatest love stories are not about perfection. They are about choice, repeated daily, despite difficulty. This is the power of the Victorian era, not the restriction and propriety that define its surface, but the profound human capacity for connection, for growth, for the creation of meaning even in the midst of pain. Subscribe to Victorian Romance audio stories and join us for more tales of love, loss, redemption, and the extraordinary capacity of the human heart to transform itself and those around it. Until next time, remember, true love is not about protecting someone from difficulty. It is about accompanying them through it. It is not about two perfect people coming together. It is about two imperfect people choosing daily to remain.